In episode 061 of the Midnight Rider News Show, we brought you Mae Brussell's first two episodes in a 5-part series she did on the 1978 Jonestown Massacre. Now those two episodes, episodes 365 and 366 in her catalog, focused on the early breaking news in the case. Now Mae was just superhuman in her ability to gather information quickly in a pre-internet age. She was amazing. And because those episodes proved to be quite popular, and because we had some emails asking us to do so, tonight we're going to bring you the final 3 episodes in her series on Jonestown.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over. Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Vince Palomera. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 071, Mae Brussell on Jonestown, Part 2. Now, the castle is sufficiently tidy, so let's get right to it. This is the 5th installment of the Midnight Rider News Legends series, and for those new to the Midnight Rider News Legends series, we wanted to really find a way to say a heartfelt thank you to the researchers and authors who have come before us, those who have really paved the way so that we can do what we do. So every 4 to 6 weeks, we play a classic presentation, interview, or broadcast from one of the trailblazers in the field. That's what we do, and we hope you like it. So tonight, we're bringing you parts 3 through 5 of Mae Brussell's 5-part series on Jonestown. Now, in Mae's catalog, these would be shows 367, 368, and 369. So as you can imagine, this is quite a long show consisting of 3 Mae Brussell episodes back to back to back. So take your time with this, enjoy it, and listen to the legend, Mae Brussell. Here she is.
Good evening, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's December the 15th, and this is tape number 367, side 1. This is part 3 on the story of Guyana. I hope that the other tapes are making sense to you. I'm getting a lot of phone calls and letters about them, and I'm trying to put this tragic event into the proper order, the way I see it, and see if the news that comes out in the years to follow fits into my original opinions or conclusions on the matter. We're suffering here from an information overload on the West Coast to practically nothing in the Midwest, and a few articles trickling out on the East Coast. I'm getting telephone calls, with the exception of Washington Post, the New York Times. I'm getting calls around the country from people who are getting absolutely no news about the Guyana affair. And on the other hand, out here on the West Coast, of course, where the families are involved, the newspapers are filled with a lot of information, so that I have thousands of articles here, and now there are books coming out on the subject, and I'll try to put them into some order for you. Before I begin on that, I hoped to get out some letters for those of you that take the tapes every week for a long, long time, and wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. There's just too much mail and too many things coming down, so I won't be able to get around to it personally. I really wanted to. Suffice it to say I love you. Some of you are just like my family. I'm very, very close to many of the people who have subscribed to these tapes or Tape Dialogue Conspiracy for many years. I'm going back 7-8 years have taped the radio programs. and I keep in contact with many of you, almost day-to-day basis, a lot of you, an extension of my personal family, and have become close. So I'm thinking of all of you at the holidays, and I just want to say hi and have a good year. And I know we'll keep in touch as we've been doing in the past, but in place of sending a card, I'm saying happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or whatever it is you celebrate. Now to the story of Guyana, Part 3. There are many articles, as I say. There's an interesting article that those of you who are serious researchers should obtain. It's December the 4th, 1978, and it's a long story about the Layton family. Just yesterday, the son, Larry Layton, took the responsibility for the shooting of several people at the airport in Guyana. And there's a long article. It's called The Layton Family's Tragedy, From Hitler's Germany to Jim Jones' Commune. That's an interesting title because this commune has been compared to a concentration camp. And I knew that the mother of Larry Layton came from Germany, and that his sister was one of the people in charge of the financial affairs of Jonestown. And Debbie left and tried to expose what was coming down just months before this terrible event took place. But there's a long article. I'm going to discuss that for a few minutes for those of you that don't get the New York Times, and if you can, get a hold of it. But in the corner of that article is a picture of Dr. Lawrence Layton, and it has his biography, the story of his life in the article, but there's a picture of him. And if you take the picture of Dr. Lawrence Layton, Monday, December 4th, 1978, it's a New York Times story, and you look at that picture. The story was written by Robert Lindsay, and then go to Time magazine, April the 11th, 1977, and see the picture of George de Mohrenschildt. George and Jean de Mohrenschildt were Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA agent contacts in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. George de Mohrenschildt was shot just prior to being called before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a primary witness, and he was in the Defense Department, worked for the Defense and State Department, and was arrested as a Nazi spy during World War II. He has the highest links to the Tsarist Russian, the Solidarists, and the White Russian community, and the Gestapo. And George de Mohrenschildt's picture was in Time magazine, April the 11th, 1977. And if you take that picture and look at the photograph of December 4th, 1978, of Dr. Lawrence Layton, Layton was born in America and goes back many generations, his family in American history, but it's an amazing picture of the eyes, the eyebrows, the hairline, the ears, the chin, the nose. If the biography in the New York Times weren't stated, if that weren't true, I would say that Dr. Layton was some relative of George de Mohrenschildt. We know that his brother, von Mohrenschildt, worked at the Hoover Library at Stanford in Palo Alto. And Stanford Research has been a part of this mind control program, this experimentation of the SLA and the UCLA school, and connected with Hughes Medical Institute, the doctors, through the mind control drugs and experiments. And I think it's interesting. Von Mohrenschildt is at Stanford University, and Dr. Lawrence Layton is up in Berkeley, and almost all the members of his family were involved in People's Temple and were involved in giving money to them through secret funds or whatever, sources and open funds. And these pictures are just amazing, and it's just worth passing on to you because you should check them out and see what it looks like. There was an article in the Black Panther paper this last week that thought that there was a small neutron bomb or testing of mass deaths down in Guyana because it was perfectly obvious that nobody was to set foot into the compound until everybody was good and rotted, and then they could wear masks and come in and pick up the people and take them away. I don't know whether that's true or not. We have no way of knowing whether it was just cyanide and injections that they took because there are so few autopsies except on 7 people so far. But the article in the New York Times, December the 4th, is very interesting on Dr. Lawrence Layton. It describes his family as being intelligent, have plenty of money, education, and a proud tradition of Quaker nonviolence. Now, that's kind of a contradiction because if you talk about Ruth Payne, who housed Marina Oswald, as devout Quakers, her husband worked for Bell Helicopter during the height of the Vietnam War, and even a gentleman claimed that he received a rifle from Ruth Paine that was later found identical to the one found in the Texas School Book Depository. We know that Richard Nixon was a Quaker and espoused nonviolence, if the Quakers are nonviolent, and yet pushed napalm and weapons and war in Southeast Asia and Cambodia and Laos. And the one religion, whether it's Catholic, Jewish, Quaker, or whatever their policy, Ten Commandments says, thou shalt not kill. Yet Henry Kissinger, whether he's Jew or Gentile, certainly believes in killing. And if you don't believe it, look what's going on over in Iran and Nicaragua and all over the entire world. The State Department, people who are highly religious, don't think a thing about killing. So the New York Times has a big cover story about their great Quaker cover, but their tradition of nonviolence, which is a contradiction to everything that Robert Lindsay goes on and writes. He says that Lawrence Layton was at Penn State University getting a doctorate in biochemistry when he met Lisa Phillips. That's Larry Layton's mother. I think that's interesting, too, because de Mohrenschildt was in Pennsylvania. His first wife, when he came to this country, was from there, the Sharples family, very high up socially. And there was a large article on the Pennsylvania connections to the various conspiracies and assassinations. But Lawrence Layton needed a tutor. Again, another similarity of Marina Oswald living with Ruth Paine, who needed a tutor to learn the Russian language. In that case, Lawrence Layton here needed a tutor, and he met Lisa, and we'll go into her biography. That's the mother of Larry Layton, who's now confessed to setting off these shootings down in Guyana. He met her in the spring of 1941 and married her in October 41. Again, another quick romance like Lee and Marina Oswald. Their backgrounds, according to Robert Lindsay, the New York Times, were far apart. He was an aristocratic family from West Virginia. Family helped settle Virginia 225 years ago, ancestry back to the Mayflower. They had extreme wealth. The parents had adjoining estates before they married. The property was run by slaves. That would be typical to the Guyana situation. Again, white people directing blacks. I don't think much has changed in the last 225 years. And he was brought up very strictly as a Methodist. His father died. The property they had was sold to Union Carbide plant. In 1946, Lawrence Layton, the father of Larry Layton, joined research for the Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, worked at the University of Maryland faculty on scientific research. And when Debbie Layton was born, maybe the karma came over on her, poor kid. She was born in Utah in 1953, where her father was promoted Director of Chemical Warfare. The United States Army Dugway Proving Ground in 1951. Lawrence Layton was promoted Director of Chemical Warfare, assigned to develop nerve gas, and he said he was ambitious. They doubled his salary, became Chief of Biochemistry, Director of Chemical Warfare in Utah, the father of Larry Layton. And this is the family that was going to give so much money and funds to Jim Jones. High-class, intellectual college professors, again, overeducated. It reminds me of the SLA, where college graduates, Emily William Harris, Angela Gary Atwood, teachers, college people come out and join a motley crowd and go to the prisons to meet black prisoners and get started in the Berkeley scene to create a lot of violence out in California. Again, from Indiana, the same place where Mr. Beekman, who's now charged for 4 murders down in Guyana, came from, and Bloomington, Indiana, where Jim Jones also went to school. They came to California in 1954. He was Associate Director of Research for the Army's Bureau of Ordnance. He helped develop missiles and satellite weapons and did weapon research until 1957. And in 1957, he came to Berkeley as a research scientist at the Department of Agriculture's Western Regional Research. That's interesting that he was into agricultural research, because one of the necessities that Jim Jones had when he went down to Guyana, that it had to be an agricultural post. And that's Dr. Lawrence Layton, the father of Larry Layton, Debbie Layton, the dead ringer of George de Mohrenschildt. Now his wife, the mother of this lovely family that all became part of Jim Jones' team, the mother went down to Guyana. She died down there. Her son was down there, her daughter-in-laws, and her daughter. One escaped, but the other's there. Lisa Phillips, her name is. And again, this is an article by Mr. Lindsay. I talked to Robert Lindsay last week from the New York Times. I wanted him to come here to see some information, and he said, do you have documentation? I was citing some things that I've put on the other two tapes and will in the future, and he wanted certain documents. Well, you know, this is the way the New York Times works. They want documentation of the things I'm saying, yet they can write an article go on and on in this long December 4th article on the nonviolence of the Layton family and preach the philosophy of their minds, of the mother and father. They can go at length about that. And then, as a contradiction, repeat about the biochemistry, the germ warfare, the weapon systems, the missile systems, the chief of biochemistry of chemical warfare, and yet praise his family for their nonviolence. The major media is so full of these contradictions and bullshit. You have to separate always from what they say they are from what they do. And again, here we go to Lisa Phillips. Her father was a wealthy banker in Hamburg, Germany. She came to the United States in 1938. The family was in banking business for 200 years. According to Lindsay, they knew Germany's Jewish aristocracy, the Berensons and the Rothschilds. But they don't also say what Gentile aristocracy or Nazis they might have known there. The story is that Hugo and Anita Phillips were sure that Hitler was going to come down on all of them, so they sent their daughter Lisa to New York City, and that they were put on a train set for a death camp, the parents. This is what the story is. I would really have to do research way back, which is impossible, to get into the Interpol files, and that's why they're so important. According to that story, the parents swallowed poison capsules in a suicide attempt on a train going to a concentration camp, and because they took those capsules, they were removed from the train unconscious, and friends helped them and managed to reach Italy, and they came to the United States. This reminds me of the great escape of Henry Kissinger and his family, who managed to get to the United States also. I don't know of any incidents where people were sick on a train going to a concentration camp and were removed for medical care. I don't think it happened once, and if I'm wrong, you correct me and let me know if you've ever heard of that train stopping because somebody was sick. Incidentally, her mother did commit suicide, finally, a few years ago, Lisa's mother, and then Lisa died down again of cancer. But the mother commits suicide. The father is still alive, and he's living in Germany right now and was sending money to his daughter, Lisa, that went down to Jonestown out of Germany. Her uncle, Dr. James Frank, won a Nobel Peace Prize for physics in 1935. He was at Penn State University, and when she got to the United States, she went to the campus where her uncle was, and it was the same campus where Lawrence Layton was doing his research. Lisa she married Lawrence Layton and then moved around with him to Rochester, New York, I guess with the Kodak people, then to Maryland, then to Provo, Utah, and then to Berkeley. And she, according to the article, became a Quaker, and they both decided they would never tell their children that she was Jewish. And according to this story, Debbie Layton found out that the mother was Jewish when she was in London. The people, this family, the Layton family, didn't like hippies. They lived in Berkeley. They didn't like, in quotes, if you can believe the New York Times, the long-haired young people who were attracted to the Berkeley campus. And the motive for getting her interested in Jim Jones was that he had direction. Now, this zombie freaked-out man who's pulling chicken livers out of toilets and smelly livers out of your throat, it's really hard to believe that he could influence a woman who grew up with bankers and scientists and Nobel Prize winners and PhDs and the chief of security for the entire chemical warfare, the director of chemical warfare at the United States Army Dugway Proving Ground. It's hard to believe that this family comes from Germany, goes to Pennsylvania, meets a man like this, and that whole family, the white entourage around Jim Jones, again, was very sophisticated, very wealthy, very educated. And there's more to this story than they want to connect, and that's what we're doing this for, to make these connections and to ask these important questions. Debbie Layton was born in Utah maybe that's why her mother got the cancer. Her mother was always afraid of cancer, and now there's government studies coming out of Provo, Utah, of people having cancer. A great number of them are having cancer because of the testing and the chemical warfare. There, again, I guess their karma is coming through. No wonder she had fear of cancer all of her life, and the attraction was supposed to be Jim Jones, who would cure her cancer, because she went to a meeting and I guess pulled out of her rectum one of these dirty old chicken livers or something, and this woman who had so much sophistication was supposed to believe that this freaky man on drugs and getting inoculations and wearing his dark glasses and acting so ridiculous, we're supposed to believe that she thought he could cure her cancer. Debbie was born in Utah, as I say, while her father was director of chemical warfare. At the day they moved out to California, where he went on to design weapon systems and missiles, and he had an international reputation for research. He lectured at Oxford, Cambridge, and University in Paris. He worked on monkeys also. He did research to test human allergies. He worked on monkeys. So did Jim Jones sell monkeys, and so did Dr. Jose Delgado. Have his monkeys at Yale University to implant electrodes and do experimentations. You see, there's an unanswered question here, because down at Guyana with his open port, Jim Jones had planes flying in and removing people. They haven't yet figured out where 200 or 300, at least 200 are. And some people went down there and planes took them away, medical planes. They were supposed to be hurt by machetes or other things. And from down there, the word has come that people did fly them away. So we don't know whether there were experiments on 1, 2, or 300, or whether people were reshuffled back or forth. All we know is that they had to be destroyed. But it's interesting, a common denominator between Lawrence Layton and Jose Delgado and the mind control and Jim Jones, of course, is the monkeys. And I really don't know how many other people are experimenting on monkeys that you and I know. Another coincidence. Debbie's family at a mansion. They were wealthy, extremely wealthy. Pool, tennis court, $350,000 home. And according to one book, The Suicide Cult, the thing that attracted Debbie Layton to Jim Jones was her disdain for the people in Berkeley that were into the anti-war movement or the demonstrations. But in the New York Times article, it says that she joined the demonstrations and experimented with drugs. Actually, both of them could be true, because many of the people that were from the extreme right-wing counterintelligence or even the Hells Angels types can be very Nazi or fascist, but can also experiment in drugs. And there's no contradiction there, really. But one article says that she was in some of the demonstrations experimenting with drugs. They decided to send her to a school in London. And again, there's a fine lady who takes these tapes, Marge Gibson, who always says the British are coming. The British are coming because so much of these conspiracies goes back to the Bank of London and Montreal and London. And who knows? I have to give Marge credit. Maybe in this international story, London is certainly directing a lot of this. And Debbie goes to London. And the important thing isn't just that she goes there to this Quaker school in Yorkshire, England, where they tell her that her mother is Jewish. But she meets a man named George Philip Blakey. I hope to God he isn't related to G. Robert Blakey of the House Select Committee, but in this world of brothers like Alan and John Foster Dulles and goodness knows who, there is a George Philip Blakey here who was a boyfriend of Debbie Layton. And this is the sister again of the gentleman who just yesterday had said, 2 days ago, that he was responsible for the shooting of some of the people in the Guyana airplane at the airport. Well, her boyfriend came from a wealthy family, too, in Northumberland, and they visited Ukiah. They went up in Ukiah, California, where Jim Jones was, and Larry Jones was up there. She went to see her brother, Larry, who was up there as a conscientious objector during the war. He was working at a hospital in Mendocino and came across Jim Jones. And Debbie came back with Philip Blakey from England, and they went from California and went down to Guyana. Now, according to this story, Jim Jones married Debbie to Philip Blakey, but the marriage was never consummated. They were separated by Jones, and according to him, it was never consummated. But Blakey went from England, and he left California and went directly down to Guyana to make that settlement down there. And that one of the big important questions in outlining this material that I'll be going into in a few minutes is who are the original people that went down and got the land, and what were they doing there from 73 to 77 before the large mass of people were dumped down there. How many people came and went, and were there experimentations, and what were their qualifications, and who directed this operation? Now, this Blakey from England went down there. He not only went down there, but he survived. I don't know where he is now. I haven't seen his name in the news much. He went down to Guyana, and at the time of all these killings, he was on a boat. He was on a boat owned by the commune, and the boat went out and came back. A lot of the gold and diamonds are missing. Money is missing. According to Mark Lane in the literature, he says, hell, he knew what was going on, but so did the FBI and State Department and CIA, et cetera, et cetera. So how much did Blakey know? George Philip Blakey. That's a name to put on your list and see where he is and see if he's called and what questions he's asked. Because a lot of the money came from Montreal banks down to and British banks, and money was coming from Europe, from the Leighton family, from Lisa Phillips' father, or an unknown source. This New York Times says that there was some unknown source, some special fund that was going down there for Jim Jones. In addition to giving him $250,000 plus more, there was some fund from Germany, from her family, or secret special fund that was going down there. And I think that the Montreal banks, the British banks, should be investigated. I don't know that they ever will, but I think that this person, this George Philip Blakey, is an interesting character. He comes from a wealthy family in England and goes down to a plantation with a few poor blacks down in Guyana, an agricultural, in quotes, agricultural farm where you have mass beatings and punishments and sexual deprivations. And it's really hard to believe that people with that culture and education would stay there for 10 minutes unless they were supposed to. One of the important things here is that after World War II, after the American armies went into the concentration camps, we never had a psychological study of the men and women who met the people at the gates, who took their clothes, except for the one woman who made lampshades and soap out of the skin of various people. We never got a good psychological profile or an interview. These people went back to their homes, near Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. They had babies, they had families, they listened to music at night, they had a culture, they went to church on Sunday. They were ordinary people. They looked just like anybody else. And the whole emphasis of the German guilt was placed in Nuremberg on the very highest order that gave the people that gave the orders, like Watergate. We saw John Mitchell, and we saw Maurice Stans and E. Howard Hunt, the men caught at the hotel, and Robert Marty, and just a handful of people, Herbert Kalmbach, and a handful of people responsible, Robert Haldeman, John Ehrlichman. But the dirty tricks involved turning out lights at airports when planes were arriving, ordering food to be sent to Shirley Chisholm's campaign when people weren't going to be there, calling off campaigns, putting acid in Senator Muskie's drink to make him act irresponsible, and hundreds of people hired by Donald Segretti around the country for various, in quotes, tricks or violences, or the plans to create violence in Miami at the 1972 conventions, such as happened in Chicago. We never see the faces or the psychological profiles of the everyday 9 to 12, take a lunch break, 1 to 5 job. What do these people look like? They look just like you and me, and they get paid, and we can't separate them in our minds. They all melt in like ordinary people. Yet there are social structures, and this is very important. There are stratas just as strong as the caste system in India. There are social structures that separate the wealthy, landed gentry in England, years of education, the landed gentry of the Leighton family, the wealth. It's true that kids may have had too much guilt of having money or their father making weapon systems, and they want to be anti-war people. But the violence that went down in Jim Jones' place, and this Grace Stone was on Phil Donahue's show talking about the beatings, and she had to stand on the stage and make everybody laugh and smile while they were beat, and people were beat until they had, one man till he had to have a catheter put in 100 times because he wouldn't say thank you. afterwards, and they were beaten bloody and put out in shacks, etc. So what is the mentality of the landed gentry, the college-educated, the scientists, the children of the educated, to allow a barbarian society in front of them to exist, and then to be totally free of it, to show disregard for what happened, the people that are back now, and the people that escaped. The coterie around them are let loose again, just like they were after World War II. Larry Layton, the son of Lawrence Layton, was born in 1946 while his father was at the University of Maryland. He was at Johns Hopkins doing drug research. When his father moved to Utah, it must have affected him with his dad, chief of biochemistry, the security and the activities that go on at an Army base like that. When your father is director of chemical warfare, it certainly must tell you that anything else you do after that has to be kosher, and to know your father is making missiles and satellites and weapons. Now, Lawrence Layton, in his interview, says, well, Larry was lonely, like Lee Harvey Oswald was lonely, or all the alleged assassins were lonely, James Earl Ray or Arthur Bremer, all lonely. He graduated from Berkeley High School. He went to Davis, where he met a woman, Carolyn Moore. Now, that's another woman who's out now. She hasn't been declared dead. Along with Mr. Blakey, this is an interesting person because she married Lawrence Layton, and her father's a Protestant minister in Davis. I noticed that in the cast of characters, and I'm creating these different personalities, they either are concerned with the church, related to the church, ministers, children, just like Mr. Lawrence Layton's grandfather was a Methodist minister, very strict. The ministers and the churches and the nursing profession run through this entire story, the wedding of the nursing profession with the churches. And Carolyn's father is a Protestant minister in Davis. They were married in 1966, and instead of military duty, Lawrence Layton went up to do medical technician up in Ukiah in Mendocino State Hospital, and that wasn't far from where Jim Jones was working, and that's where they met. In 1968, it was Carolyn Layton, the daughter of the minister up in Davis, who became the first member of the Layton family to join Jim Jones. And then Larry, her husband, went on to be a key lieutenant of Jim Jones. And he loved Carolyn, and Jones took her away from him. And then Jones stopped him from writing to his own parents and stopped making phone calls. And then the couple were divorced, and Lawrence Layton then fell in love with Karen, and she's now dead. She was down at Jonestown and was listed among the dead. And then Jim Jones took Karen away from Larry Layton also. He made Carolyn, first wife, and Karen, the second wife, watch him while Larry had homosexual acts with Jim Jones. He took the two women away from Larry, but he made the women watch him have homosexual relationships with Larry. And he was told what an awful father he had at home. Lawrence Layton and Jim Jones did a job of turning them against their parents, turning them against their wives, and turning them against themselves. And yet they all remained. On side 2 of this tape, we'll continue on with some more of not only the Layton family, but then a book, The Suicide Cult, and the chronology of the Jonestown story and what was left out of the suicide. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is tape number 367, side 2, December the 15th, 1978. And this is the third in the series on Guyana. We'll probably go on to 4 or 5 tapes, and then we'll do a rundown, update on the news, and then get back to some more on this important matter. Last week, I gave you a sheet that was enclosed with the tape of the categories, the way I saw Guyana falling into place after about 2 weeks of information coming in. I made that list. I updated it, and I'm putting that in this week's tape so that you can see, various researchers who are following this closely, how I add new files. I work with these boxes of files, 100 at a time I get, and label them. I can shuffle them, rearrange them, add numbers. The basic numbers stay the same, and if something fits in between, I just add an A, B, C, or D. I mean, there are 2 books out on the Guyana affair, one by Mr. Krauss in the Washington Post, and the other by Marshall Kilduff and Ron Javers, the co-author of this one, The Suicide Cult, came from Harvard University, moved out to San Francisco. I get skeptical of some of these Eastern people trying to understand this California violence or phenomena, which he obviously doesn't do. The most important category of my research always is the chronology, the overlay of the years. It's very important to see what happened at what time and then compare it to other events taking place at the same time. And I think after years I learned that the chronological layer of events is terribly important, the most important thing to read and analyze. And then you also can see how much is left out from one book and how much is left out from another, these important years. I took the book, The Suicide Cult, and went through it one time and typed up into about 40 or 50 pages everything in chronological order that was included in this hasty book. It only came out 3 weeks after the murders in Guyana. What Mr. Kilduff leaves out, of course, is the education and the qualification for Jim Jones to get juveniles, to be able to have them sent to him, even a person on parole who is sent or probation down to him, or disabled people or mentally sick. He doesn't ask those questions at all, why the state would send these children to him. He doesn't explain why he would build a barbed wire fence with towers around the property in Ukiah. There's no explanation in detail of what went on in his life, 1950, 51, or 52. He doesn't explain, Marshall Kilduff, how the mayor of Indianapolis appointed Jim Jones director of Human Rights Commission. Just because he adopted an Oriental child and a black child doesn't really explain how he becomes the director of Human Rights in 1960. In 1958, in Indiana, he met Charles Beekman. Beekman is a common denominator, he and Mark Lane, through this whole era. Lane certainly surfaced after the Kennedy assassination and ends up with the woman who's in charge of money for hit teams in his apartment 3 weeks before all the violences came down. Along with Mark Lane is Charles Beekman, who had a 20-year friendship with Jim Jones, who's now being charged for the murder of 4 people down in Georgetown. The contacts of Bloomington, Indiana are totally ignored. He doesn't even mention the university and the work at Bloomington. The Brazil trip is passed over in the most half-assed way, and of course that was the primary connecting link of this whole story. The 1961 to 1963 trip of Jim Jones, when he was allegedly working with the CIA and the U.S. Embassy was bringing him his groceries and food and transportation, and he lived in a large home and took trips to Argentina and other places while stationed in Brazil. They don't explain in this book why medical and law enforcement authorities in Indiana were probing Jim Jones in 1971 when he'd already left for California years earlier. He mentions that they were going into his activities in 1971, but doesn't even question what in the world they'd be looking into them then if he is in California. They mentioned that the state and federal internal revenue knew that he wasn't filing taxes after 1965, and he wasn't investigated. He also was protected by the Los Angeles Police Department, and charges were dropped when he was picked up there. He had 2 foundations that didn't file papers, and there were no prosecutions, but there's no connection between the IRS and the Internal Revenue and the tax deductions and the shenanigans at the present time with the same freedom that he had in 65 on up, where they didn't touch any of his papers or investigate how his money came in or what he was doing. In this book, they mention, when you get into the chronology, they took trips to Detroit, trips to Texas, Mexico, Washington, D.C., They don't bother to ask who he saw or why he went. I heard Marshall Kilduff on television. He said the title, The Suicide Cult, wasn't exactly right because it was a religious group that didn't think of themselves as any kind of cult. Once they got down there, Jones had made sure that there was no way to get out. So that isn't a cult. They weren't there of their own free will. They couldn't come and go, and people had no access to transportation or ways to get out. And he agreed that many were murdered just recently. This week in the newspaper, they said as many as 70 may have been murdered. But again, there's several hundred missing. And there are no autopsies except for 7 people. So the cover story, The Suicide Cult, is just that, and has no account of those trips to Mexico or Texas or Washington. Those cities come up in this book, and if you go back even to the first outline I did 2 weeks after the death took place, I had earmarked Houston, Texas, and Mexico as areas to look into. There are many names left out of this book. Of course, they don't seek them. It's a quick book, a fast book to make a buck, and that's all it does. The one good thing that gets lost in here that I want to call attention to on page 188, there are quotations from various newspaper people on what happened down in Guyana and interpretations from the Japanese press and people around the world. But the best explanation of motive was from Munich, Germany. I don't know if I can pronounce this, the Süddeutsche Zeitung from Munich, Germany. A newspaper down there had an opinion on the suicide, what they call the suicide cult, and this is what they said in quotes. American society is composed of joiners, of people who like to form associations, where a bunch of joiners got together after World War I and formed the National Socialist Party. That's pretty heavy coming now, and I think that's what this is, a continuation of the Nazification of the world that was started by a group of joiners after World War I, and it's on page 188 of the book, The Suicide Cult. As I say, I took every date in the book and typed it up, page number, date, and what event took place. Of course, they begin with when Jim was born in Indiana. He married Marceline Baldwin, a nurse, in 1949. In 1950, they moved to Indianapolis, and then he jumps to 1964. He was finally ordained a minister in the Christian Church branch of Disciple of Christ. Keep in mind always with your chronology that from 61 to 63 he was in Brazil, and then when he comes home from Brazil, he's ordained. So we don't know what he was doing in Brazil. He didn't have a teaching credential. He wasn't a minister. He was down in 2 years in Brazil with the American Embassy. In 1956, they said he found enough money to purchase a former synagogue in Indiana. The synagogue was in Indianapolis. In 1960, the mayor appointed Jim Jones director of the Indianapolis Human Rights Commission. Again, no explanation of why, except that he had these mixed children, the white, Asian, and black, that were adopted. In 1963, according to this chronology, the People's Temple changed its name, People's Temple Full Gospel Church, and he said money was a mysterious commodity. He had enough finances to travel and promote himself. Now, keep in mind again, he goes down to Brazil, spends 2 years there, and then all of a sudden, he has a mysterious commodity known as cash and finances to travel. There's an interesting coincidence. There's several coincidences in this story that we'll go into, but Esquire magazine had an article naming 2 places that would be saved from nuclear bombs, one Ukiah, California, and the other Belo Horizonte in Brazil. Later, Mark Lane went to the Hunter family up north and told them he was a reporter from Esquire magazine, and he used an alias to get an interview from members of the People's Temple. Evidently, Esquire has, I don't know if there's any connection here, but interesting point. Clay Felker now runs Esquire. He was from the CIA, and Esquire magazine has always been antagonistic to various conspiracy theories. They've never helped the researchers along in any way that I've ever noticed, but it was Esquire that had this article talking about Belo Horizonte that sent Jim Jones down there. It may be that he read the Esquire story, but didn't explain how he took his wife and family and went running down to Brazil. In this book, The Suicide Cult, he leaves out the entire Brazil trip. He has 3 sentences to describe Jim Jones in Brazil. It said, Kuldoff says he decided to take his family to Brazil for rest and scouting mission. For self-proclaimed missionary experiences, he enjoyed a brief stopover in backward British Guyana, later now known as Guyana. It was Guyana then, British Guyana, now known as Guyana. And that's all he says about Brazil and Jim Jones, and yet the Brazil trip would be the one that could unlock the medical experimentation, the future use of Guyana, the money he's going to have when he comes back to the United States, his future programming of blacks, and his Nazification and processes in the Bay Area where he takes his large mass down and prepares them to die, and their state is in a mind where those who aren't totally brainwashed have to be murdered, but they take this mass down there at 77 and they're slaughtered in 78, and it seems they knew all along they were preparing to kill all these people. In 1958, Charles Edward Beekman, who's now 42, became friends of Jim Jones in Indiana. That goes back 20 years. You have to read the book, The Control of Candy Jones, The Mind Control of Candy Jones. She was sent from New York City, where her offices for a modeling agency were across from John Tunney, and she was linked to the CIA through these particular people, the Tunney family, and through the FBI, and she was fed a line right to Oakland, California for her telephone mind control, and her first CIA trip began in 1965. Beekman and Jim Jones met in 58, but they've been friends for 20 years. And then Candy was trained to keep nothing in writing, to have hypnosis and drugs, to have a gross and global loss of memory, and she was taught to hate and to stay away from black people and to dislike black people, and the same for Jews. And in her book she tells about her hypnotism and the influence that the warfare state had on her, and she refers to the hard controls began to come down on her in experimentation in 1957, where she began to do her first work for the CIA. And Charles Edward Beekman met Jim Jones in Indiana. This was in 1958, and this is one of the questions we have to ask about his background, what he was doing then. Just several weeks ago, he killed Krista Amos, 10 years old, and Leon Harris, 21, Martin Amos, 9, and their mother. He cut their throats. Ron Javers and Marshall Kuldoff make a big apology. They go overboard to explain why Jim Jones liked Guyana. They said in the 1960s, he liked the Victorian homes. The Guyanese people were sweet and friendly. They spoke English. The transportation wasn't too costly, etc., which is just, again, a lot of literary bullshit. When Jim Jones went down there, he hardly went into Georgetown. He compromised the officials. He had his women sleeping with them, photographing them. Mr. Burnham was put in by the CIA. He wanted isolated property. And after the death of over 900 people down there, the people in Georgetown that made the newspaper writers interviewed didn't even know that there was a Jonestown nearby and didn't know anything about it. Most of the people in the country didn't even know it existed. The architecture was the last thing he was looking for. Victorian architecture was the last thing Jim Jones was interested in. But again, these writers have to give you this cockamamie story to cover up what is the real story. Now, in this chronology, in 1963, Jim Jones gets a small fleet of buses and begins touring through the Midwest. This reminds me of Charlie Manson getting out of prison and going to Sacramento. And in the book The Family, Ed Sanders says, as winter oozed on, he bought a bus and equipped it with stereo and chicks and took an 18-month trip to the Southwest. Well, this is the way Jim Jones, with no noticeable occupation, he set up a storefront and had all this money, comes home from Brazil and has all this money, and he's taking a trip. Again, on page 23 of this book, it mentions that in 1971, the Indianapolis State Board of Psychology examiners was interested in studying the faith healing of Jim Jones and went into the medical and law enforcement authorities suggesting maybe they should question his practices, but decided they were powerless to go into what he was claiming he was doing. And again, that's interesting that it's put for this year because Jim Jones had left there in 1971. He wasn't even there. In 1970, in Indiana, the Secretary of State revoked the corporate license. Jim Jones had a corporate license for a company called Wings of Deliverance and one called the Jim, that's Jim, Lou, L-U, Mar, I guess Marcelina Corporation, a nonprofit enterprise. They never filed annual reports for tax deductions. They were founded in 1965. They got tax foundations from 1965, but they never filed with the IRS. In 1966 to 1970, Wings of Deliverance never filed corporate tax returns. The Jim Lou Mar Corporation filed only the first year, yet the state never prosecuted the corporations. The IRS never investigated them. And another link, according to Kilduff and Jevers, this is another link in his good luck. You see in the files that I gave you where I have Jim Jones favors from the IRS, we put it right into that section. Where we have favors, the LAPD's arrested, we put it right in there. With the IRS today, they never touched Jim Jones' funding or financing or the accumulation of millions. They had a hands-off policy in 65 when he formed the corporations and came home from Brazil, and they have it right up to today. The Washington Post had a big article this week. Jim Jones' story, Guyana, is over. The whole story is over. And then below, it talks about the secret $10 million that are in banks in Bahamas, France, England, Switzerland, Panama. And they don't even want to know where the money came from or who deposited it or where it's going to go. But the story, for all purposes, is over. Jim leaves Indianapolis in 1965 and goes out to the West Coast. Marvin Sweeney joined his temple, W-S-I-N-N-E-Y, and Jackie Sweeney. They both joined his temple. He worked for an electronics firm, and they show up in Ukiah, California. Again, names to see if they died down in Jonestown or if they still stayed with him. Marceline became an inspector for a state nursing home. He built 40-acre home. He had property, 40 acres, and he had a home for boys and 3 convalescent centers. Now, what license, what expertise did Jim Jones have to take care of boys and convalescents? The state gives them the money or gives them these bodies. Why put up a tower, guards, dogs, literally a closed-off camp? And, of course, the question is go into the records and find out who were the boys in 1967 up in Ukiah. Who were the boys? Their names, where are they now, and what was their condition? Are they alive? Are they dead? Did they go to Guyana? Who turned this piece of property, human property, over to Jim Jones and Marceline, this nursing home where he built this place on 40 acres? He called it a temple with special tax favors. He not only got these people delivered to him and had this compound, but he got into local politics. He was appointed to the grand jury. He was chosen as the foreman. He became director of Mendocino and Lake County's Legal Services Foundation. And then he won over a man named Tim Stowen, whose name you've seen in the news a lot, who was the county council up there in Mendocino, and he used him to work for him as his lawyer, as a legal counselor. Stowen and then later Grace Stowen, they were together up there and gave legal services. They later moved to San Francisco, where Joe Freitas, the district attorney, was asked by Jim Jones to put Stowen as assistant district attorney in San Francisco, and he got that position coming down from Mendocino. He was placed as a counsel there. He was a county counsel in Mendocino, and Jones had followers from the parole officers, radio dispatchers, sheriff services, and moved to San Francisco, bought the building on Geary Street in 1972, and then the money again was pouring in from these various people, and they were having a lot of cash donations, and he was able to buy that temple headquarters, which was formerly a synagogue in San Francisco. In 1971, Deborah Layton, the young woman I talked about on the first side of this tape, went to People's Temple. According to Kilduff, she wasn't one of those rootless people, one of those anti-war people marching around Berkeley or the hippies. She wasn't one of the rootless. She had, in quotes, a strong sense of mission and discipline, a great contrast to the aimless, drug-oriented ferment of Berkeley. That's page 114. The discipline and the mission reminds me of the background of her German mother and her father with his military defense, germ warfare, expertise. And they go on to say she became the financial secretary of People's Temple, the confidant of Jones, and that she would flash $65,000 in Social Security checks a month that she stashed away. But then she had a little reserve, in quotes, and then in quotes, for experimental community in Guyana. And this money was coming in that was to be put aside for an experimental community in Guyana. Interesting, because Lawrence Layton was into agricultural work and experiment for the federal government, and one of the requirements was an agricultural station as a cover for Jim Jones in Guyana. The chronology, I'm taking all this chronology from the Suicide Cult, then I'll take the other books and the newspaper articles, but I'm just using this one book now with these various dates. And Jim Jones went down to Los Angeles and got another church in Los Angeles, a third synagogue. He bought a synagogue in San Francisco, Indianapolis, and then Los Angeles on Alvarado. He moved down to L.A., and then he begins traveling. Now, it's interesting, page 42, he talks about Jim Jones in Los Angeles, but there's a void there from 71 to 73 where he doesn't bother to pinpoint a date at all, and yet these dates are very important. And then he says he began traveling. He was flying around the country. He had a retinue of bodyguards and aides. He talked to ministers in Detroit, Houston, Texas, and St. Louis. Of course, ministers are the missionaries that ran the School for Assassins in Mexico. And whether or not there's a connection, we'll find out in the future, I hope. But he took buses down to Mexico and people to Disneyland and Washington, D.C., and the inauguration of Jimmy Carter, he took people back there, bus loads. He founded a record company called the Brotherhood Records. I don't know if it's any relationship to Mike Kerb, our lieutenant governor in California now, who was in the music business for the CIA as a front. He came out here and worked with Mr. Vagary and the most far right wing of counterintelligence. That I mistrust Mike Kerb, our lieutenant governor, who's in the music business. So we have to, again, ask the most unthinkable questions. Where is the Brotherhood of Records organization? What records have they made? It was supposed to be music sold by the People's Temple, a large interracial youth choir and orchestra. To read Kilduff, you'd think it was like the Mormon Tabernacle, but I've never heard anything about the music he sold, and I'd sure like to get those records. I bet they're collector's items. But in late 1973, according to this chronology, and this is the important part, besides the years 61 to 63 when he's in Brazil that are left out of the book, this is page 88. He says, another destination for People's Temple's money emerged, a newfound colony in the jungles of Guyana. Now, late 73 is when the UCLA school to study the causes of violent behavior was certainly on the rocks, and it was not going to be allowed to go through. And by December 73 was the time when Earl Bryan said in California, I had that on the tape, I believe it was last week or the week before, they had to have some alternative means for studying these people and studying violence because Dr. Marcus Foster had just been shot. Well, page 88 of this book mentions a Dan Phillips. That's the name you have to follow and look into. A Dan Phillips went with Jim Jones and a dozen top church leaders, and they went to Guyana with a large sum of money. The grand jury should call Dan Phillips, or they should find out if he's among the missing, or if he's dead, or who he is. Who were the 12 men who went down to Guyana for the original purchase? In other words, are these men from the Defense Department? Are they former veterans? Are they medical men? This is one of the clues about the first purchase of that land. According to this Kuldoff book, which of course he hasn't researched or thought along these lines, find Dan Phillips, who went with Jim Jones and 12 other, in quotes, church leaders. Call those 12 men. Identify their names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 12. What were their occupations? If they were top church leaders, what were their occupations at the time they went down there? How did they earn their living? Were they any with police departments? Were they former veterans from the war in Vietnam? Were they with the Defense Department? What were their occupations? What was their medical training, their legal background, government connections? Who set this up? Were the 12 down there when the 900 died? How did they die? Are they alive? Where are they now? This is the team to look for. This is one of the big clues. Those dozen top church leaders. Now, Marshall Kilduff has written this with Ron Jabber, so he must know there were a dozen that went down there, and I'm sure they weren't just the black slaves that were picking the vegetables. They had a bank draft from Barclays of Canada to deposit money in Georgetown. Each had $5,000 cash. They had a bank draft for $600,000. It was late in 1973, as I say, when that school was halted that I talked about before. It was in late 73 when Earl Bryan said, we have to find another way. When the National Institute of Mental Health, Health Education and Welfare, the governor, Ronald Reagan, Stanford Research, UCLA, the CIA were looking for ways, along with the Boston hospital doctors, to work on blacks and study suicides and mass fingerprinting. So the question is, who went down to Guyana and who purchased the boats down there? The requirements were that they have an open port. Who built the airstrip? Who arranged the purchase of the boats? Who manned the boats? The first four went down there, according to this book on page 92. The first four went down there December the 9th, 1973, all members of the inner circle. December the 16th, another 12 went down there. Now, the criteria that Jim Jones had, he had two main criteria. A, it had to be isolated. Remember, he said later, once I get them down there, there's no way for them to leave. A, it had to be isolated, and B, they had to grow their own food to be an agricultural mission. Again, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau were isolated. What were the conditions of having their own food then? There would be no excuse for going in and out or people purchasing or leaving messages. Well, if they could eat their vegetables, supposedly, I guess, and put people to work from 6 in the morning till 10 at night and give them a good long day to conk out and go to bed and no questions asked. The conditions, 4 other conditions Jim Jones said they wanted was it had to be accessible to water. They have an open boat with river, right on the river. The land had to have the potential for agriculture for them to work on. It had to be largely uninhabited with few villages around, and they were protected by the jungle and uninhabited. There was no one close by. And 4, it had to be close to Venezuela. If the settlers had to escape, they could flee. This is page 93 of the book, The Suicide Cult. Even in bad books, bad articles, you pick up information. As I say, you skim away the bullshit and you come out with a little bit of the story of the conditions of what went on. So this is very important. They should name all the bodies that returned from Guyana, all 910. They haven't given out a list of that yet, even though they have passports and they have the fingerprints and the bodies before they cremate. Name each body there, state whether it is a black or a white body, and its age, children versus old people or middle ages, where they came from. Cities like Indiana, Texas, the inner circle, who set it up, how many of those people out of the original 1,200 or the people that set it up originally are missing. Did 4 and 12 go down with Jim Jones, those 16 that had nothing to do with this? They just set it up like you set up a missionary for 20 people in Mexico that could send assassins all over the world for 20 years. 16 people could do this here. They had that land from 72 to 77 until this large brown group of black people were brought down there. 73 to 77, what was going on for those 4 years? He was setting it up from 71. And how many took a boat to Venezuela? Now, these are impossible to ask, these questions, but those are the questions that give you the answers to what went on in Georgetown. The Suicide Cult book describes the use of the media. Again, what UCLA school was planning while they did their experimentations and electrodes and brain surgery, they were supposed to have access to the media with interviews praising and lauding their research. The People's Temple in San Francisco had a newspaper. They circulated actually about 60,000 papers a day. The money was put up by Dr. Carlton Goodland, a black doctor in San Francisco, who I had called about 6 years ago. He's having a conference on black problems in San Francisco, and I had called and wanted to participate in the conference, and I accused him of being a cover-up bastard. That was 6 or 7 years ago. I was contacting Carlton Goodland and sounding him out, and it turns out he was the doctor of Jim Jones all this time with his complex medical problems. The newspaper had pictures of German concentration camps, Ku Klux Klan rallies, and so forth, and they had radio time on KFAX Saturday. So the media in San Francisco was projecting this great organization with the Democrats up there and the news media and praising Jim Jones and lauding his work while something sinister was being planned down on the northern coast there of South America. This tape is about out now, so next week we'll continue with part 4 on Jim Jones and the slaughter down in Guyana. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 368. It's part 4 in the series on Guyana. It's December 22nd, and this is side 1. There were several items in the news this week that may have skipped your attention, and I'd want to dwell on those particular articles with you because we don't want to lose sight of them. The first one was Friday, December the 8th, 1978. The lead article, Memo Discusses Smuggling Witness into Guyana. This is written by Nicholas Hurrock of the New York Times, and it has to do with a correspondence of Terry Buford, the woman closest to Jim Jones, who made the deposit of their money into banks in Zurich and Panama, England, France, and there's supposed to be 12 different bank accounts. Going into many, many millions, and this is the woman that is staying at Mark Lane's home right now. And it seems that she was discussing with Jim Jones through correspondence early in the year, moving Miss Walden, that's Miss Grace Stevens, from Memphis to Guyana in the custody of Jim Jones. I want to go into that and the implications of this with you. Also, there's another article that is interrelated. It's not separate. And it was in the various newspapers, but covered in 3 different ways, and I want to discuss that with you. And the lead article is Tennessee Parole Probe Not Over, because we're talking again about Tennessee. Grace Walden is in Tennessee. James Earl Ray is in Tennessee. And I want to go right into the story. First, of this investigation of the governor. He'll be out in January, Governor Ray Blanton. And then on to Grace Stevens, and then some more about Mark Lane. You now have my outline that was enclosed with the tape last week of the categories that I do my research under for the Guyana story. And the way I add new stories as they come are to put new numbers, as I explained before, under the various sections. And under Section 6, Conspiratorial Links, I now make a section called 67A, Martin Luther King assassination, and 67B, Angola mercenaries, because we'll go into that. And then under cities and countries, I forgot to put Panama and also Angola. Those are important countries, and I'll explain why later, but I want to tell you how I do add, when I get new information, I add to these basic files, and they just keep growing. In 1977, when the House Select Committee started doing their work into the assassination of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King, there were a rash of deaths of very important witnesses that took place one after the other. In April, there was George de Mohrenschildt and Charles Nicoletti, Carlos Prios Sequeiros. I talked about those on my tape, April 11th, 1977. That was Dialogue Conspiracy number 264. And just as I mentioned last week, I had talked about the School for Assassins down in Guyana, August 15th, 77. I also talked about the escape, the second escape of James Earl Ray. The first one was in St. Louis, Missouri, the first round before Martin Luther King was killed. But tape number 274, those of you who have it can play it over, and those of you who don't have it, I'll give a little more update and background on it. It was June the 20th, 1977, and I went into great length about the fact that James Earl Ray was to be the primary witness before the House Select Committee. Probably the two most important witnesses who could go before the committee in Washington, D.C. would be Grace Stevens and James Earl Ray. And I mentioned at the time that that escape that James Earl Ray did was a phony escape. It served a lot of purposes, and I think that he would have been allowed to leave, except that the House Committee was just under formation. They were just beginning to start, and they got outraged at the fact that James Earl Ray had escaped, particularly the Black Caucus. So that there was an article in the Washington Post, George Lardner said, Hill Assassination Unit to probe Ray's escape. And I said at the time that the only reason they brought him back was that there was too much pressure on the governor in Tennessee, that they intended to let him leave, but there was too much pressure. And the witnesses, as I say, in the John Kennedy assassination, Gary Powers, William Sullivan, George de Mohrenschildt, the major witnesses were dying off like flies, and at that same time they were planning the escape and hoping they could get away with it of James Earl Ray. And then I'll show you through the New York Times article that they were also planning to get rid of Grace Stevens. As it turned out, they didn't use her before the House Select Committee, and they didn't even use James Earl Ray. He was told that he would come back and testify about where he had been and his expenses, and the House Select Committee took $6 million for their investigation and didn't call James Earl Ray or Grace Stevens, but there was a plan afoot to get rid of both of them, just as there was to get rid of these other major witnesses. I also did a tape, before I go on to these news articles, number 294, that was November the 6th, 1977, on Robert Watson. He was a witness to a conversation about killing Martin Luther King that involved members of the John Birch Society and gun running and narcotics traffic and assassination team. And this also, this Georgia connection is very important to the Martin Luther King assassination, and may have very important links down to the Guyana story, because Watson worked closely with Dick Gregory and Mark Lane, and Mark didn't use any of his material before the House Select Committee. The entire hearings, Robert Watson was in a federal prison on a narcotics rap, he said, was planted on him, and I got a Christmas card from him. He's out. But he had a lot of information that he was promised would be used by the House Select Committee, and they came to see him in the federal prison and took affidavits from him and information on the conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, and didn't use that information, and now he's out, and I'm sure that they'll never use any of his information, and he'll keep quiet because he's glad to be home. The Monterey Herald, our local paper here, had a story about the governor of Tennessee, and I'm going to compare the coverage for you between the Monterey Herald, the San Jose Mercury, and the San Francisco Chronicle, because I think it illustrates how the news is projected in each individual paper and how important it is for me doing my research to read 10 or 12 papers a day, the ones that I subscribe and then the clippings that are sent to me from friends around the country. In order to get a full picture, or even a fraction, I won't say I get a full picture, but a fraction, you have to take a cross-section of newspapers. The Monterey Herald had an Associated Press story. All of these came from the AP, so that means it was up to the desk to cut out what they wanted. The AP story, December 19th, 1978, has a lead story, Faces State Court Hearing Grand Jury, Parole Selling Scandal, Meshes a Tennessee Governor. This has to do with Nashville, Tennessee Governor Ray Blanton, who didn't run for election this year. Of course, he's been under investigation for several years, and he's going out. He's a Democratic governor, and in January he'll be out. But the grand jury, according to the Monterey Herald story, was investigating a parole-selling scandal that, in quotes, is scarring his final days of administration. Blanton was subpoenaed to appear with undisclosed office files following the rest of his two top assistants, one by the name of Charles Benson, another Mr. T. Edward Sisk. That's his legal counsel, or was. He's now hired James Neal, a former Watergate special prosecutor, as a legal counsel for Blanton. Of course, what else would it be? You have Leon Jaworski hiding the real Watergate stories of murders and assassinations and possible drug running of the CIA and smuggling of narcotics and weapons, along with these political assassination teams. And then here's James Neal, a special Watergate prosecutor, who's representing Mr. Ray Blanton, and I'm sure that Blanton knows so much that he'll just get a little slap on the wrist. Also charged in the same case, and this is the important name, is Lieutenant Charles Frederick Taylor, 40 years old, who's been 15 years on the Tennessee Highway Patrol. Taylor was suspended without pay and held for a $100,000 bond in Memphis, and the other two are out. The article says the bank accounts of Sisk and Benson and Taylor and others have been investigated by the CIA, and they were by the FBI, not the CIA, I'm sorry, and there were marked bills and money was deposited in their account. It said, Blanton said, in quotes, if his aides are convicted, it would be a great affront to the dignity of all Tennesseans. Now that's the Associated Press story from the Monterey Herald, which doesn't really tell you much except that the governor and his legal counsel and an assistant are involved in a highway patrolman by the name of Frederick Taylor are involved in a scandal there of receiving some money of selling paroles. The next article is from the San Jose Mercury, the lead story saying Tennessee parole probe not over. It goes on to say the evidence so far examined in the parole hearing arrest of 3 aides to Governor Ray Blanton may be, in quotes, only the tip of the iceberg, said the FBI officials. We heard that by Senator Howard Baker when the Watergate investigation was entirely over. The great investigators such as James Neal and Leon Jaworski, they told us as they closed the book, the tip of the iceberg, you only got the tip. The FBI said we have a long way to go. The federal agents have accused the aides of trading paroles, extraditions, and pardons for cash. So the same AP wire service by the San Jose Mercury goes into extraditions and pardons as well as paroles. The 3 men were charged with conspiracy and extortion. It goes on to say how long the governor's office has been investigated. The federal complaint said that Benson had documents for the executive commutation of sentence of a man by the name of Larry Hacker, a convicted burglar. Hacker supposedly engineered the 1977 prison escape of James Earl Ray, convicted assassin of Reverend Martin Luther King. So that article goes a little further, and then we go back to June 20th, 1977 on Dialogue Conspiracy, and I was talking about that phony escape, and this article, a year and a half later, talks about Mr. Hacker engineering the escape of James Earl Ray, and then money going into the desk and offices of the attorney and the governor, and in return they're going to let this man off on a parole. The San Francisco Chronicle has another article on the same subject but written differently, and its lead story is Tennessee Scandal. Parole selling probe is going full steam. And it says the governor of Tennessee accepted the resignation of 2 assistants who've been arrested on the federal charge of extortion, conspiracy, to sell paroles, and for commutations and extraditions. The FBI complaint said that Charles Benson, who was the extradition officer for the governor of Tennessee, had legal papers bearing upon the early release of Larry Ed Hacker, reputed ringleader in the escape in 1977 from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary with James Earl Ray. I got out my notebook and information that I had done on that phony escape and the radio show that I had done, the work that I had done for that particular episode, because this so-called escape was coming just at the time, as I say, when James Earl Ray would be called as a major witness, and I alluded to very famous possible escapes that seem historically to be accurate. New research coming out about John Wilkes Booth, Amelia Earhart, the actual murder of the Lindbergh baby, Lee Harvey Oswald, the Tsar and Tsarina, and the head of the Russian family and their children, and even Adolf Hitler. For some of you that are buying this tape or ordering it just for the Guyana series, I'm going into this because it precedes the next part of Guyana, and it explains possibly what Guyana was about, in addition to being a school for assassins and a place where mind-controlled experimentation could be done and various witnesses could be flown in or out. It raises the possibility, would they have flown James Earl Ray down there? Did they fly him out? The governor at the time said they thought he was in Nicaragua. He gave that as a speculation that he could be in Nicaragua. But was Guyana used for something else during the years before a large group of black people were brought down there for a front? I mentioned, this is June 20th, 1977, about the way that James Earl Ray, in quotes, escaped. And I said there was more to the story than they were telling, and one reason for this scene would be to have an excuse to move him from a state to a federal prison, which would be easier to handle. And I said that they had taken him out of the country but brought him back because there was too much attention paid to it and there would be a major investigation, and that it was a dry run for another escape. They've promised him that he would be able to escape. And I went into the physical tactics of that so-called escape. The wires were cut that night. The voltage was off. The telephones were out of order for 15 minutes. There was a corner of the wall that he was supposed to go off. Nobody guarded it. The closest guard didn't shoot. He was reading a book. He was supposed to shoot if anyone was 10 feet away from the wall, and he was reading a book. There was a diversion area out in the yard where a man pretended he broke his foot. There was a false altercation. He went with 6 other people, and this is the interesting part. The emergency tower was unguarded, and I talked about his work in the laundry room and the man in the laundry room helping him escape, and about the prison intelligence network that allowed him to escape. The warden, or was the warden at the time, that said he might be in Guatemala, and I thought that was interesting because Guyana is very far away from Panama or Guatemala, and People's Temple had members visiting Panama, making bank deposits and so forth, that could have flown him back or taken him, if he had escaped, right down to Guyana. And I mentioned a Edward Hacker who was arrested inside of a rural Baptist church. Edward Hacker. And I wondered if this church was a place for James Earl Ray to escape to and meet, because I mentioned that the people that killed Officer Tippett at the time that John Kennedy was murdered ran into a church and hid down the street in a church, and it was a safe place because nobody suspects a church, and churches make good getaway places. You don't go in with the bloodhounds looking for somebody in church. And I wondered how in the world Edward Hacker got inside the church. And I went into his background and speculated that Hacker had planned the organizing of the escape, that he worked in the plumbers unit. Remember, the White House plumbers, and the plumbing unit is a name for people that fix things. There was a plumber from Lockheed, St. Caesar, that has been accused of being killed. The researchers have said he's the one who killed Robert Kennedy, that Sirhan did not do the fatal shot. And there are a lot of plumbers that are involved. The White House plumbers set up, that's a code name for a lot of assassinations and conspiracies. And I did mention that I believe that Mr. Hacker, who was in the church, had a part in the escape of James Earl Ray. That was in June 1977 that I was saying this, and now the complaint in this trial is that they were trying to get executive commutation for that same Larry Hacker that I was talking about, that convicted burglar, that it was indeed Larry Hacker who helped James Earl Ray escape, and that it seems that in return for letting them get out, these high-up officials in Tennessee were given money, and evidently they promised him that if he does this and helps him get out, that they'd be paid off, the officials would be paid off, and he'd be paid off by getting an early parole. Instead of, I don't even think there was a trial. I think they were all put back in their cell, and nothing more was said about that crazy escape. But I think it was a dry run, and I think there were a lot of purposes that I went into the last tape. And Mark Lane, being the attorney for James Earl Ray, and being the attorney for Grace Stevens, and also for the People's Temple, you have one plan where the highest officials of the state not only locked up Grace Stevens in a mental hospital, but they released her to Mark Lane, and they were being paid off to give parole to a man who had gotten out with James Earl Ray, and that included the governor's attorney and the highway patrolman who was involved, and the very person that I named in 77 who assisted in this was being paid off with his early parole. Of course, the old CIA writers were out lauding James Earl Ray's great escape and saying it couldn't possibly be a conspiracy. These pathological liars who get these huge books and legal fees are so disgusting. June 12, 1977, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner-Chronicle, and William Bradford Huey, of course, saying there was no conspiracy. The article says escape or an abduction by conspirators, and Huey was saying, why, there was no conspiracy for Ray. I always told you he was going to escape. He's the only person. There never was a conspiracy. Then George McMillan, the author of The Making of an Assassin, the story of James Earl Ray, says, that's damn nonsense to say that Ray had outside help in the escape. He did it alone. I always told you he could do it. And then Percy Foreman, the attorney who had represented James Earl Ray, who told him to plead guilty the first time, rejected suggestions that this escape was part of a widespread conspiracy to help or to destroy him. He said that he just took advantage of plans of 5 other prisoners, and that conspiracies are theories as fiction, and it's all a bunch of lies. He said it's consistent with all the other lies that have been printed about Ray. It makes beautiful writing to say, oh, H.L. Hunt probably came back to life and helped him out. But he said, I won't spend my time analyzing the manure. And Julian Bond of Atlanta said, Ray's escape is terrifying. A madman is on the loose. So there's William Bradford Huey, George McMillan, Percy Foreman, and Julian Bond, and they're all a bunch of liars, because it's perfectly obvious now that the highest echelons of the government of Tennessee were paying off people and being paid for assisting James Earl Ray's escape at that time. The same cast of characters keeps coming through the last 10, 15 years as McMillan and his sister Priscilla Johnson and Percy Foreman and Huey. It's so sickening to see their names in the news, and of course they just repeat their lies. Every time the press interviews them, they have to repeat another lie. Now to the second big article, which is separate but not unrelated, because this again involves a primary witness in the Martin Luther King assassination, such an important witness that she was in the rooming house. This Grace Stevens was in the rooming house when James Earl Ray was supposed to have left the rooming house. He says he checked in, left a gun in the room that he was told to purchase. He had a few toilet articles and a radio that he had taken out of the St. Louis, Missouri prison that would identify him as having been in that room. And he claims that he was in a car that Raoul had given him money to buy, and that he wasn't in the rooming house when Martin Luther King was killed. A gun went off, and there's no identification by the FBI or police to this day that that gun was the fatal gun that killed Martin Luther King. But a man was in the rooming house, in the bathroom. He wrapped up the items that were in James Earl Ray's room, left them at the door. And there was a woman, Grace Stevens, whose husband was supposed to have seen the man leave the building, and the FBI wanted to use him as a witness that it was James Earl Ray, and she had claimed that she saw somebody leave who was much smaller and different in size than James Earl Ray. When he was picked up in London and she saw the picture, she said, oh no, that's not him. But right after the killing of Martin Luther King, several days later, the police came in Memphis, Tennessee, and took Grace Stevens to a mental hospital, and then within a very short period transferred her to another hospital where she stayed for 8 years. She goes by the name Grace Walden, and also the common law husband she had was Stevens, so she's known as Grace Walden and Grace Stevens. And as of April 28th of this year, in 1978, Grace Walden Stevens was still in the Tennessee State Prison Hospital, and I'm going into her story now, but I want to get to that New York Times article, and I think I should read it to you as much as I can on this tape, and maybe copy it and give you a printed sheet with it. I think that would be a good idea. Memorandum found in the files of Jim Jones, apparently written by official of the People's Temple, discussed the possibility of Mark Lane smuggling a witness in the Martin Luther King assassination case into Guyana using a false passport. The memo was discovered among papers dated early this year, apparently written by Terry Buford, saying confidential, and addressed to Jim Jones. In quote, I got a message over here that you want me to tell Mark Lane that he should look into some alternative means of getting Grace Walden to Guyana before the CIA might try to stop her from entering the country. Therefore, Mark should try to get her another passport. Now, just stopping right there, the implications are tremendous because Terry Buford claims that she only went to Mark Lane 3 weeks before Congressman Leo Ryan went down to Guyana, and Lane claims that he only became counsel and learned of Jim Jones in September, I guess the end of September. He went down to Guyana. He had a press conference in October, so it must have been in September. But this memo is dated the first of the year, early this year. I called Nicholas Hart. He didn't call back at the New York Times. I tried to get the date on this memo. It goes on to say, Miss Walden, a Memphis resident with a history of mental illness, has been put forth by Mr. Lane as a witness who could prove that James Earl Ray did not shoot Dr. King. Investigations by several organizations, including the House of Representatives, have found her testimony useless. But according to the memo, Mr. Lane persuaded members of the temple that the U.S. authorities wanted to silence Miss Walden. I will relay the message to Mark and see what he says, the memo said. I will do so in person, as I don't feel it is wise to do this over the phone. So the question here, of course, is, did Terry Buford get in touch with Mark Lane early in the year prior to when Grace Stevens was released from the mental hospital? Because if she did, then the collusion of the judge in Memphis, Tennessee, or even the governor, again, the same man that's involved with that escape attempt of James Earl Ray, the highest officials in the state of Memphis, Tennessee, may have been arranging for Grace to be removed from the scene just as they were arranging for James Earl Ray to be removed, because she was a primary witness. And Lane said she was an important witness who could prove that James Earl Ray was not in the rooming house, and yet he didn't insist that she come up and testify before the House Select Committee. Lane also took James Earl Ray and put him on Jack Anderson's show where he had a polygraph test, and Anderson said James is a liar. That's what his attorney did. His attorney got him publicly to be exposed as a liar before the hearings and never got James Earl Ray before the House Select Committee. And he never did anything to get Grace Stevens. Even though he keeps blaming the CIA for these conspiracies, he kept Grace Stevens away from that committee. The memo said if he doesn't have those kind of contacts to send her down there, do you think we might offer the tampering of Maxine Swaney's passport? We have her passport here, that's evidently in San Francisco, and it might be something that would be similar to Grace Walden. And also, if it doesn't look like her, maybe we'll swap the picture. The drawback of this would be, of course, if a traitor were to look at the immigration list, we would be caught in a minute. The good point of this would be we wouldn't run the risk of getting caught by a passport on the white market. The memo, signed Terry, has surfaced at a time, according to the New York Times, when more and more questions are being asked about Mark Lane's dealings with the People's Temple and the United States government on behalf of the cult. American officials spoke privately today of a letter from the lawyer, Mark Lane, to the State Department, warning that if it didn't halt the harassment of the cult, they'd have to embarrass the United States. They'd move and embarrass the United States. And then Mr. Lane had sent a letter to Congressman Leo Ryan of that effect, telling him, threatening, don't mess around with Jim Jones. Mr. Lane didn't mention the country by name, but they thought maybe it was the Soviet Union or Cuba, and Lane would be trying to embarrass the United States government. The New York Times goes on to say that Mr. Lane often appeared as the person who was feeding the paranoia into Jim Jones in Jonestown. In a news conference on September the 20th, he said that there were massive conspiracies to destroy the People's Temple and a massive conspiracy to destroy Jim Jones, initiated by the intelligence of the United States. Lane has a lawyer down in Memphis, Tennessee with him, a law associate. I don't know if she's a lawyer, by the name of April Ferguson. And in the New York Times it said Miss Ferguson said that there had been discussion about taking Miss Walden there, but there was no reason she could not have traveled openly. Well, the question is, of course, where is Grace Walden now? Because all of the time of the hearing of the House Select Committee, we never saw a view of her or a picture of her with Mark Lane like we have of Terry Buford. And, of course, the open question is she down there in Memphis, Tennessee, or was she substituted for Maxine Sweeney? It would be interesting for the State Department. I've called them to see if they found a Maxine Sweeney down in Guyana who was dead, but her passport was in the United States, and she's as good as a dead woman. If you give her passport to somebody else, that means that she never can return home. And because there's still 200 people missing and unidentified out of the 1,200 in Guyana, it would be interesting to know if any one of them was Maxine Sweeney, who was killed so that Grace could use her passport, or if Grace Stevens is alive, and also the date, early this year, because Miss Ferguson said they had discussed taking Miss Walden there. But if they discussed it early in the year, then Mark Lane is lying about the dates that he started to meet Terry Buford, and he's lying about the date that he started working for Jim Jones, or that Jones was interested in his case. And why in the world would Jim Jones be wanting to help Mark Lane get this woman, Grace Walden, down to Guyana? He had a saying, anyone who goes down there has no way out. And if she was a primary witness, Lane accused the CIA of trying to hamper her testifying before the committee, but she was a primary witness, and he was trying to get her out of this country and out of planet Earth forever by sending her down there. That wasn't protection, and yet her own attorney was instrumental in these shenanigans. On November the 4th, 1978, Duncan Ragsdale from Memphis, Tennessee, an attorney, was assigned as co-conservator for Grace Stevens. I'll do more about Grace Stevens on the other side of this tape, and some more about Mark Lane and Guyana, the tragedy known as Guyana. This is tape number 368, December 22nd, 1978, side 2, and part 4 on the tragedy known as Guyana. Those of you that listened to the House Select Committee on Assassinations this last November watched the spectacle of Mark Lane with Duncan Ragsdale, their co-guardians of Grace Stevens, and here was this important witness that Lane should have been protecting as an attorney. He checked her out of the Tennessee Mental Hospital after being 8 years there, and took her to California, somewhere in Orange County, and then took her back to Memphis to his home. And before the House Committee hearings, they talked about her mental condition, and it was decided between the various people on the panel and Mr. Duncan Ragsdale and Mark Lane that no purpose would be served in having Grace Walden here at this time. I thought that was interesting. If Lane sincerely believed that she was a primary witness and that she was in good care, that they should at least have seen the woman, just as they should have had James Earl Ray up there again telling about his experiences instead of third or fourth person parties removed from him talking. The judge said that they have to have a counsel for her, and Ragsdale was assigned to this case. He had never met Lane before, and he didn't know Grace, but he was assigned, and Ragsdale and Lane were before the committee prior to Grace Stevens being represented by Mark Lane. A group of doctors came on and talked about her mental condition in the hospital, the 8 years that she was confined. Then Lane made a big scene. He didn't act like an attorney who had waited this many years to represent a person, a primary witness, before the House Select Committee. He made a big scene and screamed to the panel, "You have violated confidential doctor and patient relationship," which they probably did. He said, "You violated ordinary conduct and destroyed Grace Walden," which they certainly tried to do, but he could have brought her in. And he accused them, until this moment I couldn't accurately know how bad you were. He accused them of being corrupt and evil men, which they were. Then he said Grace takes no drugs at this time. She's living a normal life, and this is Gulag Bulva. He was referring to the institution in Tennessee where she was confined, and he said, you all make me sick. And he got up and stormed out of the room. He left Mr. Ragsdale with the information and medical memos, keep her locked up until James Earl Ray's trial is over. And there was a lot of indication in the records that she was, in fact, a political prisoner. But he didn't bring that out as an attorney. This was the one chance in a lifetime he had a client. He let down James Earl Ray. He let down Grace Stevens. And at the very time that all this was going on, November the 14th, was when Leo Ryan was planning to go down to Guyana. And Mark Lane must have heard about it that afternoon because he kicked up a storm, and in the middle of the hearings, he was representing a client, Grace Stevens. In the middle of those hearings, he tore out like a bat out of hell and didn't even come back, and Mr. Ragsdale was left with the information. Lane didn't even stay in the room, and you know he must have prepared something. It was on radio across the country, and here was his hearing. And at that time, Leo Ryan said, I'm going down to Guyana. And Lane had corresponded or told him, you can't go without me. And Leo Ryan said, who is Mark Lane to tell me when to go? I'm going anyway. And Leo Ryan arrived in Georgetown November the 15th, early in the morning, and had phoned Charles Gary and Mark Lane. And Mark was in Washington for the House Select Committee November the 14th. So he literally tore himself out and was just, he says, coincidentally sitting on a plane going to Guyana with Charles Gary. And his behavior was really weird because Lane had to get in. The congressman couldn't get to Jonestown. But Lane got through and said, just give me a little time. This is a quotation from a book and newspaper articles. Give us 2 hours to talk in Jonestown to see if they want you to come. And Jackie Spear, Leo Ryan's aide, said, you're stalling, Mark, you're stalling. Let's get the show on the road. Well, considering the correspondence of Terry Buford and Jim Jones about getting Grace Stevens down there, I think it's important that somebody from the wire services interview Grace Stevens and make sure she is alive, living at Mark Lane's house. Can you see Grace Stevens, this witness to the Martin Luther King assassination, and Terry Buford from the International Banking Assassination Front team of Jim Jones and Mark Lane in a cozy little house scene in Memphis, Tennessee. Mark has moved down to Tennessee, the place where this corrupt governor works and these various officers that have been fired. And in the book, The Suicide Cult, in the back of the book, it tells the story about Charles Gary and Mark Lane and about their departure from there and how Mark had separate food. It said Lane, the specialist in conspiracies, confided he had known something odd was going all along and kept it from Charles Gary. He also knew about suicide plans, but so did the U.S. agencies, including the State Department, the CIA, and FBI. They were aware of the suicide plans, and Lane also heard that they were going to lace the sandwiches with drugs, so he took along his cough drops, and knew all along that the agencies were also familiar with the suicide plans, which in fact turned out to be true, but was Lane just a representative also of those agencies? So the question is, because the way he tore out of the congressional hearings, because of the speed with which he had to get to Jonestown, because he had to get there first, also because of the unidentified dead, and one of the boats went out, and there's an article this week that they were instructed, leave Saturday and don't come back until Sunday. Is there any chance at all that Grace Stevens is there? We'll know in a few weeks if we get enough news people. You might call the FBI in Memphis, Tennessee, and ask about this. Call Nicholas Herrick at the New York Times. I've called, and I've called various desks at the Washington Post, and you reach a dead end. And it seems to me if they really wanted a story to follow this up, after printing this little tidbit about Lane and Grace Stevens, they would follow it up. But I've reached a dead end from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the State Department. So maybe you can needle them a little and find out what's behind this. The National Labor Caucus has an article which is interesting and is a continuation of some of the questions I asked last week on tape number 367. I referred to that New York Times article, December the 4th, 78, and talked about the man who allegedly married Debbie Layton, George Philip Blakey. Her name is Debbie Layton Blakey, and you have that tape. Most of you are getting this whole 4-part series. You can look that up in the literature with it. I'm going to read you an article by Jeffrey Steinberg and show you how it relates to the past work that I've done. It opens up a few more doors and windows to think about until we continue next week. This article is dated December the 5th, and it said, information released yesterday in New York Times, that's the article I referred to last week, cross-gridded with reports from Caribbean sources that strongly indicate that Reverend Jim Jones and the People's Temple were involved in illegal channeling of mercenaries into Angola to fight against the Angola government in 1975 and 76. The overall command was a mercenary deployment set up and coordinated by Henry Kissinger and British intelligence, the same forces behind the creation of People's Temple and its eventual establishment in Guyana. You notice that under finances and under countries, I have England, and also I have to add Canada. I didn't put that on the list, but the Canadian banks and the British banks were indeed responsible for the deposits in Georgetown and the Jim Jones purchase, or not the purchase, but the leasing of that land. It says, key evidence for this charge appears in the front page feature of New York Times, December 4th, by Robert Lindsay on the background of the Layton family. The Layton family member, one of them was from the American Friends Service Committee with a deployment into People's Temple. The father, a former cult member, Deborah Layton, we went into that before, whose brother has been indicted for murdering Representative Ryan. He confessed this week that he was behind the whole plan, even though he didn't shoot Ryan. He engineered this whole thing. The father, it says, was a chemical warfare expert, which we went into last week. But it says Deborah Layton was sent to Britain during the late 1960s to study at the British Friends School. She became acquainted with a British national, Philip Blakey. Blakey, a member of the Friends, and Layton returned to the United States. Remember, she said she married him, but it wasn't consummated. Both of them were members of the People's Temple. In 1974, Blakey was sent to Guyana to prepare Jones' operations there. You know, I've been stressing how important it was those years from 1973, December of 73, when the land was obtained, up till 1977. It was used for uses we'll never know until hundreds of old black people were brought down there as a front. The tally's been made now. They're mostly old black women, a bunch of old black slaves with a white entourage. Back to this article, it says, according to highly reliable sources in the Caribbean, Blakey was in Angola from 1975 to 76, functioning as a mercenary against the Angola government while still a member of the People's Temple. During that same period of time, members of an Eastern group, which a Brooklyn-based black nationalist cult, were involved in gun running and drug running. And they were sending mercenaries into Angola under the auspices of the World Council of Churches and the Ford Foundation's Interfaith Council. The East also established a center in Guyana just miles from the Jonestown settlement. And it turned out this week, in this article yet, that there is indeed a large settlement of people right next to Jonestown. It was supposed to be isolated, but there were operations going on there. You see, according to the way I cross-file, where it talks about gun running and drugs and narcotics, I'll put that under 31 in my categories of drug running. And also, if you notice my list under the conspiratorial links, number 65, I made this list 2 weeks and then updated 3 weeks after the Guyana murders, and had the World Council of Churches, for reasons, into this various interlocking conspiracy. And this article mentions the World Council of Churches. I didn't have the Ford Foundation yet. I might have guessed the Ford Foundation would be in it, but we have to add that to the list here involved. It said that they established centers in Guyana, miles from Jonestown. Blakey, who I mentioned as being a very important person, was not among the Jones cultists who perished in Guyana. He is presently in Barbados having obtained and captained the People's Temple trawler known as the Albatross III and went on a Caribbean tour during the mass suicide. The Albatross III is registered in Panama and is believed to be involved in large-scale drug and weapons running. And again, that goes back to Section 68B, which I'm adding the country of Panama, and we put it under weapons and drugs. And it also goes again to tape number 294, November the 6th, 77, that I referred on the other side, that had to do with drugs and weapons running, narcotics and gun running, that involved the assassination teams that killed Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. This Caribbean net and the School for Assassins, of course, there was one in Mexico, and then I believe that one had been moved down to Guyana. But in this article, it talks about large-scale drug and weapons running, and it says Blakey's profile as a mercenary handler and a graduate of the British Society of Friends Network is known as the Fabian Society British Foreign Nest, subverting the United States through its various affiliations. It mentions the Friends operation being infiltrated. It provides another level of powerful evidence that the entire Jones evidence was pre-programmed and controlled on a fine-tuned basis by professional intelligence channels associated with the London Tavistock Institute. That's the one of mind control, the original mind control plans that worked in conjunction with Alan Dulles of the CIA and Reinhard Gehlen, and it is affiliated in the United States with the MK Ultra project. They concluded the article by saying a rigorous investigation of Blakey's career, and particularly its intersection with that of People's Temple attorney Mark Lane, would provide the requisite information for the resolution of the case. For those of you who are taking the tapes on Guyana are not familiar with the past tapes that I have made and radio broadcasts, I've talked about a man in British intelligence named Hugh Trevor Roper, who wrote a book on how Hitler died that is not necessarily absolute final chapter on Hitler. There is a lot of information that he possibly escaped and went to Argentina and Antarctica. And Hugh Trevor Roper could have pulled the biggest hoax of modern history by writing about Hitler's death in the bunker. His book came out just a month before anybody even actually got into the bunker. And then Mark Lane wrote his book, Rush to Judgment, with Trevor Roper writing the introduction. And Mark Lane has been the biggest obstacle to getting the truth out about the political assassinations and the way they come down. And he's covered the John Kennedy assassination the way that Hugh Trevor Roper covered Hitler's so-called death. And the story of Mark Lane going back to England, or the possible connections to Blakey. See, this mystery that the Labor caucus writes about, this Blakey profile, we have to find out because, of course, there's no way of knowing now, but Mark set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and then as soon as their offices were set up and they began working, he left Washington, D.C. and moved to California and disassociated himself from them. And G. Robert Blakey became the head counsel for the House Select Committee. And, of course, there's always the ridiculous question that I asked last week, and I ask it again. Is there any relationship between that Blakey and the Blakey that came from England and then went to Ukiah with Mr. Layton's daughter, Lisa, and with their German connections, German banking connections, and scientific and military connections and clearances? They went up to Ukiah, and Jim Jones went to Brazil, went up to Ukiah, where they all merged with Mr. Tim Stone, who's a lawyer from Stanford, graduate from Stanford, who set up the foundation work and the work for Jim Jones up in Ukiah. And Blakey had gone on down to Guyana and was one of the first people to set up that property. So we have to find out who he is, and the Labor caucus is right. The interaction of Lane and Blakey will be the answer to a lot of questions that we need to know. The Los Angeles Times has a long article, December the 4th, 1978. Mark Lane got $10,000 fee paid by the People's Temple to launch an attack against anybody who criticized the People's Temple. That was a nice little fee, and Lane's job was to offer a counter-offensive for people that were criticizing this operation down there. He would use the media and be the spokesman in the media, have press conferences to defend Jim Jones. Now, this is important because Lane has always used the media to attack the researchers of the assassinations. And I just wonder how many tens of thousands of dollars, or if he's pulling millions out of the Swiss accounts now, if he's taking a cent of it is a payoff for what he's done for the last 15 years. He's put down people that have done fine work, to Chirac and Lillian Castellano and Sherman Skolnick. I think I've mentioned some of these to you. And his strategy is to use the media to keep repeating his same old bullshit over and over about Dealey Plaza and threatening to sue the government, that they're harassing his witnesses and hurting his witnesses where he's their worst enemy, and using the media and press conferences and college lectures in order to absorb any interest in the Kennedy assassination and divert it away from anybody else who would shed the light. I'm going to quote some sections from this LA Times article because it's really important, and it's so typical of the way Lane not only worked with Jim Jones, but the way he worked with the people who were doing work on the Kennedy assassination. He ran down an article that was going to be printed in the National Enquirer that was unfavorable to Jim Jones, and he showed it to Gene Brown at Los Angeles Airport, and it was given $7,500 cash for stopping an article, showing it to them, and stopping this article, which would have exposed the People's Temple. Lane's strategy was, according to this document, it was planned September the 27th, 1978, that Mark Lane was going to have a strategy, a $10,000 fee, to use the media, and he was to use public relations offices and fundraising in Congress and have a counteroffensive against anybody who picked on Jim Jones and the People's Temple. It was to be a national campaign coordinated from a Jonestown embassy in Washington, D.C., and he would establish a 3-story building, which Lane now owns across the street from the Supreme Court, and put down anybody, as I say, who attacks Jim Jones. This campaign was, according to Mark Lane, 2 weeks after Lane first heard of People's Temple. Now, this is in the Los Angeles Times. 2 weeks after he heard of it, he was going to plan a campaign. Now, this is supposed to be September 27th, 1978, that the memo begins the offensive. So that means that he only heard of Jim Jones early in September, which you see by the other memo found down in Jonestown can hardly be true, because it was early in the year that Terry Buford was going to meet Lane personally, because talking on the phone would be too hot. Lane's strategy, according to this memo dated September 27, 1978, was to attack the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, the U.S. Post Office, the Federal Communications, alcohol and tobacco and firearm, that they all were harassing Jim Jones. Now you see, this is what the New York Times article is talking about December the 8th, that he was feeding the paranoia, if there was any down there, because actually the truth is that Jim Jones had favoritism of the CIA when he was in Brazil. He had the favoritism of the FBI, who never investigated any charges in the interest of the family, and who also allowed all the bodies to rot so we wouldn't know what is going on there. For 4 days, the FBI has been part of this terrible scandal of identifying and covering up since the murders down there. He got special favors from the church in terms of tax breaks in Indiana, and certainly accumulating millions of dollars that were unaccountable for in these various banks. Mark Lane accused the post office of interfering with Jim Jones' rights, and the truth is that Jim Jones himself, the People's Temple, were hampering with the mail and censoring and telling people what to write and keeping letters away from their family. And then he accused alcohol, tobacco, and firearms of interfering with them, and it actually is probably the case that they were more involved in getting weapons there. They were not investigated when it came to the DA's office, Mr. Freitas in San Francisco, that there's guns and many rounds of ammunition and so forth going down there. ATF didn't investigate at all, and he had the favoritism. And he had the favoritism of the Federal Communications in the way the radio messages went through, and instead of bothering him, they were letting him do Morse code and three-way messages and so forth that were actually illegal, and he was getting away with all that. Lane had another method of attack, which is interesting because this is the one he used for, again, the researchers into the Kennedy assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination or Robert Kennedy. He said in the memo, it is apparent various newspapers and freelance reporters have participated in efforts to destroy Jim, so he suggested that they counteract with lawsuits filed against the agencies, which is one of Lane's great things. He has a press conference all the time. As I said before, I'm going to sue this agency and show millions of dollars of damage have been inflicted against Jim Jones, where actually he's collecting anywhere from $13 million in overseas banks and $3 million cash in gold and diamonds. Now, Lane said that 3 weeks before Congressman Ryan made that trip, about November the 1st, was the first time that Lane learned how serious Jonestown was. That's when Mrs. Buford, Terry Buford, came to see him in New York. And October the 5th, he had a press conference that I talked about on the first tape on Guyana praising Jim Jones. But after this woman gave him all this information, he had it 3 weeks before Leo Ryan went down there. He didn't tell Leo Ryan what was going on. Lane came out of it alive. Ryan was dead. Charles Gary came down there. They stayed clean. They weren't drugged, and they stayed alive, even though Mark Lane knew 3 weeks in advance that Congressman Ryan was going into something like this, and that this actually was a place where there was an adequate diet of just rice and gravy, and that he had millions of dollars in foreign banks and $3 million in the house at Jonestown, and that they had hit squads and assassination teams, and that there were brutal beatings of persons, and that they were staging mass suicides as early as October 77. He was told all that. Other things Mark Lane knew 3 weeks before these 910, 11, 12, 913 were killed is that there was no way they could escape, that there was certain death, that people could only leave with Jim's permission, and they were not allowed contact with any people in the outside world, and that this library of Marxist books that he was supposed to have and Christian books were a lot of baloney, that most of the people were illiterate and couldn't even read the books, and that it was just a front for acting as if they were Marxists or interested in those political doctrines. Lane knew that and covered this up and let Leo Ryan walk into this nest. Lane knew that there were problems in Jonestown when he went down there. This is a long article from the Los Angeles Times, but it goes into the intrigue of Lane using the news media and how he was going to use it to protect Jim Jones and attack the critics. This was Lane's method of counteroffensive dated September the 27th that he suggested for Jim Jones, the counteroffensive memo. Contact the left publications. Have them do in-depth articles of the Temple. Use Mother Jones, the socialist newspaper in Chicago. In these times, that's another socialist newspaper, The Guardian. Lane's always used The Guardian, and he used the left. He had Larry Flint fly up the LA Free Press, and that collapsed. Plant articles in the left. In other words, the left looks ridiculous. Lane comes out a millionaire out of this whole thing. He can come out with a lot of money, but tie the whole left up with Jim Jones. And oh boy, when the deaths all come, the suicides plants in 77, won't the left look ridiculous? A congressman who was speaking out for the oppressed, at least getting involved, Leo Ryan, caring about the prisoners or the families down there, is wiped out. But the technique of Lane is so insidious because he's planted stories all over the country in various alternative or underground newspapers about the serious researchers, or tried to damn us or discredit it or get himself blown up with his various press conferences. When he has a press conference, those are the only people that used to come until the Guyana story broke. Lane suggested this is how you handle the press, the counterintelligence operation. He calls it a counterintelligence operation. Here's a man who has been fighting, supposedly, the various agencies, although I know he's worked with them all along. Lane said, in quotes in that memo, there are 2 different kinds of feature articles that should be written about the People's Temple. They are to be placed in publications on the left. This is just what the left needed. One should deal, if there is a left anymore, one should deal with a campaign to destroy the People's Temple, together with the work that the People's Temple has done in opposition to the war in Vietnam and in opposition to racism. We just found out this week that Jim Jones was supporting Richard Nixon and various Republicans and members of the Birch Society, funding them and working with them. But Mark Lane says, use this campaign, one, tell the harassment that is coming down on them, and two, tell the work in opposition to racism. He says an entirely separate article could be written in depth of the miracle of Jonestown. Lane suggested that you contact special interest publications, those that deal with the elderly. Let's appeal to the old people, the Native American Indians, the blacks, the people with health care problems. It is important that there be a comprehensive film seen throughout the U.S. and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world that would sell the Jonestown story. Lane said, I've already made contact with the finest French television documentary filmmaker and urged him to see the whole story of Jonestown. In addition, Lane says we should concentrate upon Geraldo Rivera for a special report on Jonestown and for ABC television. Remember that Lane is the only researcher at all who gets on Rivera and some of these national television shows. We should meet with Jack Anderson and his aide, who is a friend of mine, Les Whitten, who can run a story predicting that we will be filing action in the near future. Now remember, Jack Anderson is a man who has covered up every assassination that the various persons like myself have been trying to open up on John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Watergate story, the Wallace shooting, the Chappaquiddick. And here's the man whose program Mark Lane puts his client, James Earl Ray, prior to the House Select Committee hearings, to have Jack say, James Earl Ray is lying, there's no conspiracy. And Lane is saying, I have contacts. These are my friends, Jack Anderson and Les Whitten. We'll run stories with them. Lane said it is particularly important to create an appropriate and truthful image of People's Temple among the organizations on the left in the United States and among black people in the United States. I've already relayed these facts about the temple to Dick Gregory and Ralph Abernathy and various organizations of the left. You see what Lane does? He jazzes up a place to sell it. He calls it counterintelligence. He sells it as a fantastic thing. He brings in all the liberals and Marxists into this thing so that they can write articles and look totally ridiculous when 900 people get their injections. They said this week that out of the 910 or 11 that there were 700 murders, that there were injection shots in the arms where they couldn't have given it to themselves. So that means that a couple of hundred took this Kool-Aid by mouth and the others were all injected and were actually murdered. And somebody testified who was nearby that they heard the fellows when it was all over giving a hip hip hooray, and they were laid out in a certain position and taken away from the pavilion and put face down. They could tie in all the politicians. They could watch these people die. They were dying when Lane took off of the 4th with Charles Gary. He knew that they were all going to die. He can reap the money, and then he goes on to the next project. And what in the hell is going to be his next project? It'll be hard for him to outdo this one, but isn't this sickening? September the 27th, he got a memo on how to plan his attack, and then October the 5th, he had a press conference on KGO in San Francisco. He was on telling him about this. I talked about that on the first tape, The Wonders of Jonestown. He had a press conference in Los Angeles and the various newspaper people, and he said this is a socialist country and that it's embarrassing to the United States that such a campaign that's so fine would be an embarrassment to the United States. Part of his strategy was to get in Andrew Young, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and call attention to what is happening in terms of medicine and progress down in Guyana. After our tape goes too fast, I'm sorry, there's no more space, so we'll have to continue next week. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 369, side 1, December 29th, 1978. I'm sure many of you were interested in the news coverage of the JFK assassination the headlines that broke this week. Of course, it was a great source of satisfaction to me to see the front page of such newspapers as the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle carrying stories about new evidence to shake up the JFK probe and the possibility that there was a second gunman at the grassy knoll. This comes just as the House Select Committee is finishing their investigation, if you can call it an investigation. They're finishing their whitewash. But it's important to take note of this article, particularly after doing 15 years of research, 15 years and 1 month to the day. That's December 22nd, 1978. The front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, the first paper I get in the morning, says, new evidence shakes up the JFK probe. It goes on, the House Assassinations Committee ordered an emergency hearing to study new evidence of a possible mystery gunman, in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald being involved in the killing of President John Kennedy. And of course, I called Representative Stokes in Washington and Mr. Fenton, the chief investigator for the House Select Committee, and talked with them at length and suggested that this isn't new evidence, that they, number one, had covered it up all along. There was massive evidence that a shot came from the grassy knoll, that the grassy knoll shot would be the fatal headshot, which means that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill President Kennedy at all. And then I referred to the book, The Treason is My Daily Bread, that I talked about on tape number 346. This was August 18th, 1978. The references to this British agent named Zed, sent by Nazi Chief Martin Bormann living in Latin America. Bormann's close links, I told them, had to do with George de Mohrenschildt and Albert Osborne and Clay Shaw and the Permindex connections. This second gunman story throws out the, as I say, the guilt of Lee Harvey Oswald as the assassin. Of course, the House Select Committee will say that the second shot went amiss and didn't hit anybody, that all the shots that were fatal came from Lee Harvey Oswald, but that won't wash either, and they're really in a mess. One member of the House Select Committee was quoted in the newspaper saying it's a hell of a mess, and Representative Harold Sawyer from Michigan said the new evidence indicates without a reasonable doubt that 4 shots were fired at the motorcade. I also told them to get that car out of Dearborn, Michigan. It's stored there, the one that John Kennedy drove in, and rip out the seats. It was rebuilt later for Lyndon Johnson and was used up through, I think, Gerald Ford. Rip out all the seats and look into the metal of the back and see if you can't find some traces, because the new tests say that the shot either went right next to the car within 10 feet or inside the car, and I was told that there was something inside that car that hasn't been divulged and the car hasn't been examined. I have mentioned on other tapes that Buddy Walters from the police department in Dallas had picked up a .45 shell at the grassy knoll and had turned over to the police, and then he in turn later was killed by policemen, the witness who had this piece of evidence that was not used by the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee. And the book Treason for My Daily Bread says that this particular person used a .45, and that would fit in with the evidence that was picked up at the grassy knoll. Of course, coming at this time, it is an out for the House Select Committee. They covered up the assassination conspiracy at all levels, but it's an easy out for them because just when they're ready to give their report, they can say there's shocking new evidence and leave the door open for a conspiracy instead of spending the $6 million that they had in the 2 years that they had to start with this evidence and start with the conspiracy. They waited till the end and threw it in and said, whoops, we're out of money, we're out of time, our staff has already got jobs somewhere else. But the story, again, over the wire services was disturbing new tape may show Kennedy shot from 2 positions. That was December 21st. The San Jose Mercury came out with the 2-position story that the gunmen were used in these locations. Later on, they tried to cover up that Kennedy was not shot from 2 positions, but a bullet went astray, and this is what they'll try to use in their conclusions, I suppose. The San Jose Mercury the next day had a story, tape analysis shows the shots fired at JFK from 2 spots. The Los Angeles Times had an article, December 22nd, new data in John Kennedy slang called significant. Now, that was put on page 7, which is interesting. The Washington Post had a large front-page story. The San Francisco Chronicle had a large front-page story. The Washington Post was very impressive. It begins, experts track mystery JFK bullet from Grassy Knoll, JFK's assassination, and it got the position it should have had considering the importance of the story. But the Best Sour Grapes Award goes to the New York Times. That's the newspaper that used their Harrison Salisbury to write an introduction to the Warren Report 15 years ago, saying that anybody who questioned the findings was mentally deranged. And it was also the New York Times that had a large section on the condensation of the Warren Report for instant acceptance, that everybody would get the final word of the Warren Report when it came out 14 years ago. So on page A16, hidden behind a lot of other news and very unimportant, the lead story is panel told of 4 shots at Kennedy, that a shot could have come from the Grassy Knoll, and that there may have been 4 shots, but it's a very low-key article coming from the New York Times that pushed the Warren Report so hard and made a lot of profit at it at the same time, and published an account of one of the printings of the Warren Report. They were very careful on page 16 to give it the least amount of space in terms of inches and headlines that they possibly could, and yet cover, and of course I call that the sour grapes. It's interesting to follow the way the media handles this kind of information after being part of the conspiracy cover-up for so many years. But as I say, the Washington Post was really upfront, just as they were in a great part of the Watergate story. They were anxious to get the news out for whatever reason, and they did cover a large story. The Assassination Information Bureau is a group of young men that was formed in the 70s, 1973, 74, and had that conference in Boston in 1975 that was the beginning of the setting up of the House Select Committee. And they're located in Washington, D.C. now, and they have a newsletter. I'm giving you the address here in case you don't have it. And they have a summary, a response of 7 critics on the House Select Committee hearings. And they have an interview with Jerry Polikoff, David Lifton, Sylvia Marr, Harold Weisberg, Paul Hawk, Bernard Fensterwald, and Carl Oglesby. And next week on this tape, I'm going to do an hour analysis of the 7 critics' view of the House Select Committee hearings, because many of you who take these tapes have my analysis of and critique of the House Select Committee. And I want to go into detail the 7 questions that each one of these people were asked, as opposed to my point of view. I think it's very clear for you to understand where Mae Brussell is and how she differs from these particular critics. You see, I have accused all of these critics of we call them critics of the Warren Commission, of working with the FBI, working with the War Department, the National Security Agency, the National Security Council, that each one of these people is hiding the real military operations behind the killing of Kennedy. They're hiding the Permindex connections, the international gun running, the dope dealing, the future military dictatorships that came into power. Each one of these critics was asked 7 questions. What new evidence did the House Committee develop? What mistakes or omissions did they make? What were your hopes of the public hearings? Was it doomed from the start? How did Richard Sprague compare with Robert Blakey, the first attorney that was hired? Will the JFK issue be relegated now to the past as part of history? And what are your work plans? And what I'll do next week is to take the answers given by these people, Polikoff, Lifton, Marr, Weisberg, Hawk, Fensterwald, and Oglesby, and show you their layers of cover-up, that these particular critics are selected by the AIB to keep a lid on the real story of who killed John Kennedy, and they become the next authorities, the AIB and these people. Instead of the whole story coming out, Lane set up that committee and then took a powder and moved to California, went on working with Jim Jones and the People's Temple and James Earl Ray. He abandoned the committee after it was set up in the hands of G. Robert Blakey. So next week I'm going to go into what makes Mae Brussell different than these 7 other people, how I vary with their answers, and of course what I thought about the committee is public record, by my past tapes, and then you can compare it, and it'll be an interesting study of questions that are unanswered and expose the people that are still covering it up. When John Kennedy was killed and the Warren Commission was selected by Lyndon Johnson to investigate the murder of John Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit and Lee Harvey Oswald, he appointed a commission with persons, the names I was not familiar with. I hadn't studied much of American history. I will tell you I was ignorant up to that point. I vaguely knew some of these names, but I didn't know much about their background or what they had done. So when he appointed John J. McCloy and Earl Warren and Allen Dulles and John Cooper, Richard Russell, Gerald Ford, and Hale Boggs, I didn't know those men. I wasn't familiar with their work or who they represented in Congress or what clients they represented as attorneys. But I knew enough then to begin a file folder called Warren Commission Members. And every time there was a newspaper article from the time John Kennedy was killed and this committee was set up, the Warren Commission, up to the present day, I would throw articles about these particular people into these files to get a profile of the men that were covering up the murder of the President of the United States and the man that was charged with his murder. And then, of course, Louis Nizer was on that list because he wrote the introduction of the Warren Report, one copy, and Harrison Salisbury was on that list. And then when you study the biography of these people, you become very sure that they were hand-selected to conceal the real truths behind the assassination. Now, the same can apply for you people who are much younger or even older, who understand the way to investigate now. Apply that to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and I'm going to give you a beautiful example of doing research into the background of these people. I've given you on an earlier tape their names and addresses, and you can get it from other sources. Louis Stokes, Richardson Pryor, Walter Fauntleroy, Von Burke, Christopher Dodd, Henry Ford, Floyd Fithian, Robert Edgar, Samuel Devine, Stuart McKinney, Charles Stone, and Harold Sawyer. Whenever you see their names, if you're so inclined, save articles about them, and you get an overview of the possibility of how or why they could be used this time to cover up. Later you'll find them involved in sex scandals and blackmails and payment under the table, such as Senator Talmadge is being investigated now, and a lot of scandals come up. This happened at the time of Watergate. The men in the Senate Select Committee investigating Watergate were all involved with surreptitious and clandestine activities across the board. And we have to go into the biography now of the people who covered it the second time, such as G. Robert Blakey, the chief attorney. We know that he was linked to Modalitz. He was a character witness for this particular person, tied in with organized crime and assassination teams with the Hughes Empire and Robert Mayhew. And now we have to find out if G. Robert Blakey is any relative to George Philip Blakey, who I mentioned several weeks ago on the tape number 367, Blakey of British intelligence, who set up a place to train assassins and brainwash people down in Jonestown. Is there any relationship between George Philip Blakey of the House Select Committee, not G. Robert Blakey, rather, of the House Select Committee, and George Philip Blakey from England? As I've said many times, you have to ask the most absurd questions, and sometimes you come up with some very weird and substantial answers. Now, the reason I bring that up is that Richardson Pryor was very active as chairman of the subcommittee of the House Select Committee on Assassinations here, of covering up. He was very good at covering up any important questions and playing totally dumb, even though he was a former state and federal district judge in South Carolina. As the chairman of the special subcommittee investigating the assassination of Kennedy, he was very clever. If you read their printed reports that will come out soon, you can see the quality of his questions and the evasiveness of the entire committee. But the San Jose Mercury had an interesting biography of Richardson Pryor that I think of interest, and I think it needs following up too, because he's looking for an important job. The lead article is Top Drug Panel Post Sought by Medicine Fortune Holder. San Jose Mercury. It says it's from the Washington Post. The holder of a pharmaceutical fortune, Representative Richardson Pryor, and that pharmaceutical fortune is Richardson Merrill Incorporated, wants to become the chairman of the House subcommittee that oversees the drug industry. Pryor acknowledged that he has several $1 million in the drug business and that it is potentially serious as a conflict of interest if he became the chairman of the health panel of the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee. This is an important job that's up for grabs, and he also has to supervise bills that are related to the drug industry while holding several $1 million worth of stock in drug company. The Richardson Pryor, the Judge Pryor that was so active in suppressing information on the House Select Committee that worked with G. Robert Blakey, with his links to modalities and so forth, is the head of a family holding called the Richardson Merrill Incorporated, the subject of vast, this from the Washington Post and San Jose Mercury, the vast controversies involving the production of A, the swine flu vaccine, B, thalidomide, C, anti-cholesterol drugs, which are now in the market, just this week exposed as also being cancer-producing. He's been the subject, his company, of massive lawsuits, and he also owns stock in Sterling Drug Company, which again goes to IG Farben and the Rockefeller compound. He said he recognized that there would be a potential conflict, but this is what Richardson Pryor said: I feel I could be fair and objective. I won't do anything the committee or the House leadership doesn't want me to do. Now that's in conflict with what we want them to do, because we saw the way he ran this House Select Committee. He also is chairman of the Select Committee on Ethics, and that may explain why so little happened to the Ethics Committee in the House of Representatives. There's another man, Representative Henry Waxman, a Democrat from California, a liberal, who wants to be head of this drug committee, and they will be having hearings on the swine flu claims and so forth. But here is a direct conflict of interest right on the House Select Committee when you're studying a gun-running assassination team that are in narcotics, smuggling of weapons, mind control programs, the use of drugs for mind control, and these mysterious laboratories of Sterling Drug and IG Farben. Here's a man who certainly is representing firms that cause people to be paralyzed, to be crippled, these unnecessary swine flus that were done through his company, Richardson Merrill and Company, and this is the kind of person, just one of those people that was on the House Select Committee doing the dangerous work of covering up the murder of the President of the United States. I gave you December 13th the new subtitles of the investigation into Guyana, and I want to talk with you now about the area in Section 4, Mind Control, number 34, Fingerprinting, and UCLA and Jonestown, number 40 in that section on the Dr. Schacht, and also Section C, the conspiratorial links, number 59, having to do with the Muse Medical Institute, Genetics and Immunology. I talked about the UCLA school and gave you that quotation about using the secret Nike bases in California that was published in that book by the Senate investigation on behavior modification. But also in that book, on page 319, the subject of fingerprint classification came out with regards to mind control experiments. This is a quotation from the book, which I really believe had nothing to do with mind control, except there was something that the UCLA school wanted to study on the fingers of people, and how in the world would you get the fingerprints off of them and be able to peel them off unless they were dead. They had a problem which they called fingerprint classification, because they said all fingerprint classifications group patterns in uniform, meaningful classes. But we have to break down these classifications and use what they called the Henry FBI classification of fingerprints, and also the medico-biological classification, which are due to differences in purposes. The FBI system of taking fingerprints is intended to identify and make strict replicas for their computers and for retrieval, from the computer retrieval. But the medico-biological system is planned to be a quantifiable definer of body symmetry, to interpret genetic and medical history of an individual, and to allow analysis of population, statistics for genetic, epidemiological, and medio-demographic studies. They were to devise a system other than the FBI for biological purposes, And that was part of the mind control program that was to take place at UCLA, which was stopped in late 1973 and I believe was continued down to Jonestown. The second hurried book that came out after the massacres down there, in addition to The Suicide Cult by Marshall Kuldorf, was one by Charles Kraus called The Guyana Massacre. These both came out within weeks after the deaths down there. And in the book, Guyana Massacre, on page 150, it tells about the delay in getting the bodies and the problem with taking fingerprints from these bodies. It says the stories were that inside the coffins, the decomposed bodies were awful. Limbs had fallen off. There were infestation of maggots. There was more to be done. It was necessary to identify the human remains in the containers. Prints were needed from all 10 fingers because of the absence of names or identifying documents. The prints then had to be matched with fingerprints in FBI files. Around the clock, the mortuary crews worked on the decomposition. The hands lacked firmness to make fingerprints. This forced the crews to remove the upper layer skin from each finger, slip it on their own hands over rubber gloves, and make the inked impressions. Now, this is what I tried to tell Mrs. Bouquet, whose son was killed down there, or Mr. Harris, whose daughter had her throat cut down there. Her body didn't decay, but the other families' bodies had decayed, was that they should insist on autopsies that the fingers would be slipped off of these various people in the same way that Donald DeFreeze was sent from Los Angeles to Cleveland, Ohio to be buried minus head and fingerprints. And I maintained that the bodies were allowed to rot and decay so that they could be sent to Dover, Delaware, and that they would have an excuse to work with the Hughes Medical Institute to slip the fingers off of all of these bodies and do their experiments on genetics and immunology. So it's interesting that the very first book that came out, second book that came out, on Guyana, talks about slipping the fingers off, the 10 fingers off of the bodies to remove the upper layer of skin from each finger and to go ahead and then make their impressions. And the question is, were they making impressions or did they keep the skin for those fingers for other tests? Because, as I mentioned before, they could have come in within 12 hours and identified every single body if they didn't want to use the fingers for experimentation. Also in the paper this last few weeks was a series of articles on the Hughes Empire's secret role in medical research. But I just want to share parts of that with you, which I think have to do with the San Francisco connections and the use of money that could go down to Jonestown in areas that have to be further investigated. This is by Charles Pettit from the Christian Science Monitor, but it says the intimate connections between the financial empire of Howard Hughes and the most advanced medical research in the country is now being involved with gene splicing at the University of California, in California. A lot of this was under the direction of Dr. George Thorne from Harvard Medical School. The Hughes Medical Institute was founded in 1953 with Hughes Aircraft being the sole owner. Thorne revealed the institute paid full salary of 75 scientists at 12 medical centers, including Stanford University. Now, it was Stanford Law School that sent Tim Stone up to Ukiah, where Jim Jones arrived from Brazil with $100,000 to open up his little organization there. This article says that they gave money to the University of California in San Francisco and currently has an $18 million annual budget for medical research. Some of the finest, fair, young medical researchers in the country are getting money from this support. Now, Jim Jones said that he gave money to the Schock boy, Larry Schock, for the man who administered all the cyanide and who was obviously off his rocker. The personality descriptions of people make him sound very mysterious, and his family interview, there's been one in Houston, Texas, has a lot of suggestion that the Schock story has to be gone into much, much farther. But money was put up for his medical training in Mexico. And the question is, did Jim Jones do it or the Hughes Medical Institute? They had millions of dollars in California. The Bay Area researchers are on the Hughes payroll, and they were contacted by the Chronicle. They said 2 years ago, this would be 1976, at California in San Francisco, Hughes was setting up a $4 million genetic program on the campus. They were going into genetics, immunology, and the very things that were mentioned in the UCLA book regarding fingerprinting and so forth. They're going into DNA. Remember that the Stanford research had put up a lot of money for Donald DeFreeze and experimentations in the SLA program. The overlapping of the SLA to the Jonestown is tremendous. I don't have time to go into all of it now, but we'll do it on various shows. But they were into genetic research into millions of dollars in the San Francisco area. Now, Jim Jones was supposed to have had 33 babies delivered in Jonestown. They were teaching paramedics on how to deliver babies. Yet the list of people that died there and their ages, their color, their sex were printed in the newspapers last week, a full account, and not one of those 33 babies was born. There were a group of people that left and got over to Venezuela. There was a boat that left Jonestown that went on over to Venezuela. There were people there at the time Leo Ryan was there. The question is, what did they do with these babies? Did they deliver 33? Were they the result of genetic research, of all this money, of the Hughes Medical Institute, and the ship that left with Mr. Blakey to Barbados? Did they have any of these children or babies? These questions have to be asked because at the time Moscone died in San Francisco, Mayor George Moscone, he was on a hit list, number one to go in case the Jonestown thing fell apart. He was being investigated for having received approximately $70,000 from the Hughes organization. He had tape-recorded conversations with Terry Buford and Tim Stone, a Stanford lawyer. Mr. Freitas, the district attorney in San Francisco, and the mayor of San Francisco were tape-recorded on various conversations that could be used. And because of the heavy amount of Hughes money into medical research in San Francisco and at Stanford, and the money going, Hughes money into politicians in the Bay Area, the Hughes money into genetic and immunology research, the delay in getting those fingers off, the intent of UCLA that was a recipient of CIA and Hughes money to study identically the genetic and epidemiology of people based on their fingerprints, and then the use of Dover, Delaware, which is an Army Defense Department place. The bodies could have been shipped to California. They were shipped there with the peeled fingerprints. This is a can of worms that should be gone into for a long, long time. I talked to Marshall Kilduff, who wrote the first book, The Suicide Cult, and spoke to him just this morning about the possibility of mind control and experimentation down in Jonestown. And he said, "Oh, impossible. That's terrible. It's too hard to believe. I can't believe it." I reminded him that I broke the Watergate story at a press conference in Los Angeles in August 72, and none of the newspapers would carry any of the story about Richard Nixon and L. Patrick Gray and the CIA being involved in Watergate, or Mullen Associates being a cover for the CIA. That took 9 months for James McCord to start speaking. But based upon my past track record of exposing various stories and so forth, these people still hold the line. And Kuldoff wrote a book, The Suicide Cult, but he couldn't believe that there would be mind experimentation. He says, "I'll have to talk to Mark Lane and get back to you." And of course, you know where Lane is at. The news media will block this story. A man who wrote a book on the suicide cult just freaked out to think that there should be anything. I gave him the references here to the fingerprinting, what went on in Delaware, what was quoted in Krause's book, what UCLA wanted to do, the use money in San Francisco, at the hospital in San Francisco, at Stanford, and the question about this doctor that was educated, who got his scholarship from Jones, and the Jones money could have come from Stanford research, and Jones himself could have been made into that zombie in Brazil. Those are the things that are kept out of books like Guyana Massacre and The Suicide Cult. The man panicked. He never had heard of such a thing. But the evidence is there now that they did slip the skin from each finger off those bodies there, which is what I knew they were doing, and I knew that's why they were sent to Dover, Delaware. I can't emphasize enough that if you don't get the government out of the medical business, if you don't get them out of that germ control center Down in Atlanta, Georgia, the one whose company Richardson Pryor makes the swine flu for, and studying Legionnaire disease in the air conditioning plants. If you don't break up the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and use aircraft, pay their taxes, the Internal Revenue, and then the Internal Revenue state which people get money for research, then you're going into a Dachau, Auschwitz, Treblinka concentration camp, Jonestown today, tomorrow the world. You've got to get the government out of the medical business and write to various Congress people and call talk shows and use this material. This can't just be a little in thing between you and me. You have to do part of it to take this material and this information that I pass on to you and see that it reaches congressmen and that it get the proper exposure and not be relegated to some bizarre theory, that we break down what Jonestown was really about. Mark Lane is quoted in Krause's book on page 111 as saying that when people were dying down there, that they were smiling and genuinely happy, and later there was a tape recording that shows that they were screaming and crying, and that now it turns out 700 people had been injected and murdered and hadn't committed suicide at all. This is tape number 369, side 2, December 29th, 1978. I look at the date, it reminds me we tuck another year away and begin a new one. Keep well and happy. Do the best you can. I know I never get as much done at the end of that 1 year that I wanted to do, but I do more than I thought I could in other sections, and we keep working and studying and exposing, and I sincerely believe that's the only way we're ever going to make changes in society, is by spending the time looking for the answers. If things are wrong, if they're right, accept them and enjoy them. If they're wrong, try to change them. And, of course, my way is to try to expose the people that are doing the harm. And we'll do the best we can. You stay well and have a good year, and we'll all stick together and see what we can do this year, okay? Last week on tape number 368, I talked about that New York Times article by Nicholas Horrock about Mark Lane, the memo discussing Mark Lane smuggling Grace Wald and Grace Stevens from Memphis, Tennessee down to Guyana to Jim Jones. I don't have to repeat that for you. You have the printed sheet and the information on that particular memo. But thanks to a wonderful woman who lives up north near Ukiah, who takes these tapes and also heard me on KGO talking about this problem. She sent me a very important article from the Press Democrat. This is from Ukiah, Thursday, November 23rd, 1978, which answers the question of where is Maxine Swaney. The tape mentioned in the memo that if Mark Lane doesn't have the kind of contacts to get a passport, to use Maxine Swaney's passport to take Grace Stevens down to Guyana, it said, do you think we might offer to the tampering of Maxine Swaney's passport? We have her passport here, and it may be something similar to Grace Walden. If it doesn't look like her, we can swap the pictures, and it goes on. The drawback of it would be, of course, if a trader were to look at the immigration list, we would be caught in a minute. The good point of this would be we wouldn't run the risk of getting caught by a passport on the white market. Well, this woman mailed me an article, which I didn't have, and this is the great thing about these tapes, is that every week, every single day, I'm getting feedback from all of you from different cities, and it's just fantastic, the information I'm getting. But this article, the Democrat Press, the Press Democrat, November 23rd, 1978, said that there were people who left People's Temple who ran afoul of Jones and disappeared or died, and no action was taken by the county recorder's office, even though two members, ex-members, said that Tim Stone, that was their attorney from Stanford, forged their names on courthouse documents and transferred their property to the People's Temple. Remember, Tim Stone put Jim Jones into a position up there in the grand jury. County Welfare Director Dennis Denny said the temple operated an illegal, unlicensed foster home in Redwood City. Now that's important because I asked what credentials did Jim Jones have when he came from Brazil to open any kind of a foster home, much less have the $100,000 after he was working with the CIA. This said he opened illegal, unlicensed foster homes in Redwood City and kidnapped, this is the article, kidnapped youngsters from other states to occupy the homes. Now, this is tragic because we may do one whole tape on the list of people and the breakdown of their ages and colors, and some were never identified. After he had these children there from other states, they were supported by welfare payments. When the county discovered the situation and threatened to sue, Jones had temple members appointed as guardians of the children. You know how many of these temple members had adopted children of multi-races, and the children then continued to receive public aid from the home counties of San Francisco, Alameda, and Contra Costa. But even some were kidnapped from other states and then were murdered down there in Jonestown, injected with cyanide and poison. Dennis Denny said elderly people in the care homes were taken out of the county without any permission. There is evidence that youngsters, handicapped people, and elderly had been abused in the temple homes, and that the public funds that were given to them were diverted to the church treasury. The evidence referred to the district attorney's office. No charges were ever filed. See, that goes into my section on immunity from arrest, Jim Jones. And then it goes into other people that died mysteriously. One was a Maxine Harn, who died mysteriously. She had 3 children, and she was hanged in the garage of her home in 1970. And she had just given a large amount of money to the church before her death, and Jim Jones predicted she'd commit suicide. A cousin claimed that she was devoted to her children. She didn't commit suicide. And then her 3 children were put in the custody of this foster home. Now, why did Jones want them unless the Hughes Medical, the Stanford Institute, and so forth were going to ship them down and experiment on these people? They mentioned a John Head, a 22-year-old Ukian, who took his own life in 1975. He was friends with Tim Stone, the attorney that set up the People's Temple. He gave the church $10,000 shortly before he died. He called a neighbor the night before he died, and he was at the temple. He said he had no money and nobody could bring him back to where he wanted to go. He'd been cleaned out of his money, and the next day he was dead, supposedly a suicide. Another member, now here's where we get to the point, they also asked for a probe because another member died. Her name was Maxine Swaney, the same Swaney whose passport they had in their possession, according to the New York Times memo. Maxine Swaney was killed in an automobile accident in 1976. And here is Terry Buford in early 1978 saying, in quotes, in a memo, "We have her passport here. We have her passport here." This woman died in the custody of Jim Jones. She was killed in an automobile accident in 76. Jones told his followers that she died because she wanted to leave the church. Now, they took that woman's passport and kept it. How they got it, I don't know. But she had an automobile accident. At the time, they thought it was a murder, and ex-members of the church wanted an investigation up in Ukiah. Maxine Swaney's death was called an automobile accident. Think how many automobile accidents were done to witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination that I did a tape on and listed all those witnesses. Now, here is a very important point that I want to make on this particular tape. At the time that the House Select Committee on Assassinations was investigating the murder of John Kennedy, Mark Lane, who had set up that committee, moved to California. And along with Jimmy Carter's sister, Ruth Stapleton's friend, the great Larry Flint, they set up a $1 million ad that was in 42 newspapers in the United States. Give us any information on the John Kennedy assassination. We will offer you protection. Larry Flint didn't say, give this information to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They're investigating it. He said, give it to Mark Lane. And an issue of the L.A. Free Press came out where Dick Gregory said, now the people have a form to write. And there are about 32 different articles in that L.A. Free Press, but no one's name was allowed to be used but Mark Lane's. Mark Lane's name and Dick Gregory's introduction was the sole copy of the L.A. Free Press, and in the New York Times and papers around the country they offered $1 million reward to anybody who had information on the JFK assassination. Give it to Mark Lane. And Mark became like a vacuum cleaner who could suck in the names of witnesses. He was in New York City with Ted Gandolfo. The last time Gandolfo had a clear mind and didn't start taking Prolaxin, and he said, I'll give you $100 a day to see these witnesses. Innocent people around the country, innocent in that they may have been bystanders or had information or didn't know the whole assassination plot, mailed information to Mark Lane, who was working with Les Warrington of the FBI, and Larry Flint, whose background is certainly questionable of his sources of money or connections to gun running or organized crime or narcotics, and into the White House to Jimmy Carter. This information went to Mark Lane. What did he do with it? Would teams from Jonestown, assassination teams, hit teams, run over these people, have these witnesses be killed? We don't know what they know. We don't know what they told Mark Lane. We don't know where they are. But they were offering this money as bait money for them to give it to Mark Lane. How many have been shot? How many suicides? How many car accidents? This is an unknown quantity. But when you have a woman who was killed by an automobile accident in 1976, and ex-members of the People's Temple are saying that she was killed because she intended to leave the church, and her passport is in the hands of Terry Buford, who's corresponding with Jim Jones and saying, this is too sensitive to talk about on the telephone. I'll have to go see Mark myself about getting Grace Walden down to Guyana and using another passport. We can't use the phone. I'll have to see him. It's too sensitive to do, on the phone. She says, I don't feel it's wise to use the phone for this message, to see Mark. Terry Buford, Jim Jones corresponding. What role could the members of the People's Temple who are programmed be used as assassination teams to kill witnesses or drug primary witnesses of any of the political assassinations, past, present, or future? Could they be shipped to places like Jim Jones, which was exposed when Congressman Ryan went down there? This is very important because ex-member Maxine Sweeney was killed in 76. I did locate her thanks to this party who sent me this information. I've called all around the country and the State Department, but if you ask long enough, the answers come in. And this is a very valuable piece of information that has to be delved into. What did Lane do with the answers? Who did he turn them over to? Who are the people that contacted him? And will they be killed off by these zombies who can arrange car accidents or mind control experiments after they pass the information on to him? And they had no protection. Maybe they're unsung heroes in unmarked graves, and we don't even know where they are. New Solidarity, the newspaper put out by the Labor Caucus, November the 28th, 1978, has a breakdown how the British created the Jones cult, Reverend Jones and the People's Temple, the MK Ultra program, and the death cult. I'm going to give you the address and the price here for you to order because it goes into, again, to the allegations and research they have of Mark Lane and Charles Gehry working with Anglo-American intelligence agencies since World War II, how they've infiltrated the MK Ultra program, how Lane was an Air Force intelligence officer during World War II, and his links to British intelligence, their links to Division 5 of FBI and Permindex, to Sir William Stevenson and Major Bloomfield out of Montreal, Canada. And because so much money went into Jim Jones from Canada and England, you should follow this article. It's a long, long article, and there's no use repeating it because those of you who are interested can order it and read the entire article yourselves. Another subscriber to these tapes, World Watchers tapes, up in the Bay Area, sent me an article which many of you, I'm sure, haven't seen, from the Redwood City Tribune, and I'm very grateful to them up there for sending this to me, dated December the 12th, 1978, copyright Redwood City. This is an article by Mark Simon and Dave Hoffman, and I'm quoting some of it. A CIA informant was at the Guyana airport where Representative Leo Ryan and 4 others were shot. The report to the Tribune raises the possibility that U.S. officials knew the details of Reverend Jim Jones and failed to give a warning to Congressman Leo Ryan prior to his trip. The informant was able to report to the White House a complete and accurate casualty count, including the full identity of 5 dead, within 1 hour after the November 18th incident in Port Kaituma. And if this article is true, and our Navy ships were down at Guantanamo in Cuba on an alert that weekend, we could have brought in the ships from Puerto Rico, Cuba, Venezuela, and been in there by the time the sun came up in the morning. It says the informant's presence at the instance may have been part of the CIA's involvement that goes back to Guyana affairs and dates back to the late 1960s. The information was passed to the White House shortly after the incident. The source said the information may have been given to the White House by the CIA informant at the scene of the murders. The White House information was officially confirmed 2 days later by the U.S. State Department. CIA spokesman Dale Peterson said, "We're not confirming or denying the association of the agency in this matter." Peterson acknowledged the possibility of a use of a CIA representative at the American Embassy in Georgetown, Guyana, and that they received a call from an informant at the scene of the murders, but he wouldn't confirm or deny this. According to other sources, the CIA has been involved in Guyana since the overthrow in 1960 of the government when Guyana became independent in 1966. This article goes into the Guyana mineral wealth, which we know has not been developed, and the cover, of course, is that it's a socialist country where it could be a very wealthy country when it begins to be developed by the United States interests, the multinationals. The CIA failed to inform Ryan of the dangers of the visit, the sources said, because they didn't want to jeopardize American-Guyana relations, which means they didn't want to jeopardize the future raising of the bauxite there, which is the principal source of aluminum. The CIA officials in this article believed that Ryan would never be successful in visiting Jonestown. Therefore, they kept information on Jonestown from the congressman. This is in the Redwood City Tribune. According to the Tribune, the American interest in Guyana is based largely in the South American nation's wealth of bauxite, the principal source of aluminum. Guyana is one of the world's top producers of bauxite. When Guyana became an independent nation in 1966, the Marxist People's Progressive Party was led by Cheddi Jagan, Jagan, and was installed, and it was an anti-American government. A year later, the People's National Congress split from Jagan, and they installed in the government Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, named Prime Minister. Although he on the cover is a socialist, he's friendly with the United States and the multinationals. And Burnham won an election there a year later by putting out Jagan with the help of the CIA and won 14% of the population vote, and has been in power ever since. Now we get to the cozy relationship here of Mr. Burnham and an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, Monday, December 25th, titled "Sticky Questions About the Integrity of Guyana." It says, late in the afternoon of November 20th, a small twin-engine Guyanese Air Force plane loaded with treasure lifted off from Port Kaituma airstrip, where Representative Leo Ryan and 4 other members had been killed 2 days before. This is November 20th, before the bodies are evacuated, before anyone Army gets in there, and they're letting these bodies rot in the sun. It said on the plane were Ptolemy Reed, Guyana's Deputy Prime Minister, and Viola Burnham, whose husband, L. Forbes Burnham, has ruled the country as Prime Minister for almost 15 years. Reed and Mrs. Burnham spent the afternoon of November the 20th viewing the carnage that had been discovered at Jonestown. Few people in Guyana knew that Ptolemy Reed and Mrs. Burnham personally brought more than $1 million in currency, gold, and jewelry that was recovered and uncovered among the ruins of the People's Temple, and they took it back to Georgetown. The wife of the man that CIA put into power in Guyana flew in with Ptolemy Reed, the Prime Minister, and took out $1 million in diamonds and gold and jewelry that was left there, and took it back to Georgetown. Fewer still know where the valuables are now. It's weeks later, and the police officials confirmed that the cash was aboard their plane, but they assure the foreigners who ask that that fortune is still intact. Despite assurances such as these, opponents of the Burnham government are asking questions about the relationship of the Guyanese government, the People's Temple, and what went on there. The Chronicle article goes on to say that questions have been asked of the integrity of public figures and institutions. The Burnham government has attempted to ignore questions from its domestic opponents about the People's Temple as to why they were allowed to settle in Guyana in the first place, the extent of access, that means that secret boat and airplanes that landed and took off, and the privileges that they achieved in dealing with the government and the groups involved in local and political affairs. In the Guyana Massacre, in the book The Guyana Massacre by Charles Krause, on page 39, he talks about flying into Guyana and accompanied by various officials. And it said, as we mulled around, sweating in the late afternoon heat, waiting to get into Jonestown, the guards were there with a gun. A guard whose name I never did get became somewhat friendly. He told us that every now and then, once or twice a month, private planes would land at the airstrip and pick up badly injured Americans from Jonestown. The guard told us that the townspeople and police were always told the Americans were injured working with machetes and machinery. But the guard made it clear that he thought the accidents that seemed to occur so frequently were more than a little suspicious. Now, that's what I mean by access. They're asking now the extent of the access and the privileges. That book on mind control talked about secret bases in Puerto Rico for experimentation. And I know the CIA has some Chile and probably all of Latin and South America. And Jim Jones talks about being harassed, and he says, do you want the 1,200 people here to die? There's 1,200 here. He didn't say all together or in San Francisco. And, of course, we know that there were 913 dead, and or 912, and then a handful that were in Georgetown and a few that got away. And, of course, it remains, where are the others? I spoke to a newspaper man, I might have mentioned this on one of the tapes, from San Jose that said that there was a burial grave of several hundred outside Jonestown, and I believe he said he saw it or knew about it. And, of course, getting back again to the experimentations, the babies, the people being flown out, the accidents, how many were taken out, how many were experimented on, who was born, what were they doing there, and was this $1 million of gold and jewelry that was uncovered a payoff for Mr. Burnham for what happened, for the embarrassment? Here is a man, Ptolemy Reed, who's already linked through blackmail and sexual pictures, of being compromised by Jim Jones and the team that went down there. But you have the wife of the husband of L. Forbes Burnham flying in. All these bodies are there. They haven't been picked up. They haven't been identified. The same plane that took them in from Georgetown to pick up the gold could have brought in those people in Georgetown that could have identified these people. They were lying there, rotting in the sun, bloating up, maggots taking the bodies. Well, these great public officials fly in and take $1 million in hard cash and go back to Georgetown. They certainly knew where the money was. They were delaying sending in troops. By then it was the 20th. The American troops and the medical teams could be in. The bodies were just spread out on their faces so that you couldn't identify who they were, or these possibly kidnapped children that were taken from other states. That's one of the reasons I thought they were face down, is that somebody at home would recognize those faces in the mass photographs, and it was necessary because they were marked with markers who had had the cyanide and who hadn't, and name tags were already on some of them, to turn them face down so nobody would recognize them, and maybe some very important witnesses or persons who had information on these assassinations or were involved could have been down there, but we'll never know because they were face down. And yet Dr. Ptolemy Reed, Guyana's deputy prime minister, and Viola Burnham, whose husband ruled the country as prime minister for 15 years, flew in, took the money, and left, and surveyed what they saw, which was the carnage. They viewed the carnage, spent the afternoon, took the money, and left. I think it's interesting that the woman that is working with Mark Lane, who many of the members of the People's Temple distrust, who traveled around Europe and Panama and the Bahamas making deposits of these millions of dollars for Jim Jones. This Terry Buford has a background in Navy. She was a Navy brat. They described her as a Navy brat. She taught religious school as a child, Sunday school at the Philadelphia Naval Base, and her father's former naval commander, Charles T. Buford, Jr. This is the father of Terry Buford, the woman who was called the mastermind behind Jim Jones. That's important because of the role of Stansfield Turner, the head of the CIA in Navy intelligence, Jimmy Carter, who passed off Jonestown as just being a freaky religious cult with his Navy intelligence background, a graduate of Annapolis, and of course the acting director of the FBI during Watergate. L. Patrick Gray was also a classmate of theirs, a graduate of Annapolis, and the Navy was responsible for bringing the Nazis from Germany down to South and Central America, where they were doing genetic and immunological experiments also. The woman who is singled out as being the most dangerous and the most secretive and the most powerful in the Jones operation is the daughter of a former naval commander, Charles T. Buford, Jr. His daughter was sent out to California, and the father said he would send her money for her education. She went to the University of California and graduated in 1976, but she was working for People's Temple a long time before that and living at People's Temple, and the father would send her money for her education, and it was cashed by the People's Temple and Jim Jones. So again, we don't have any way of knowing how much money that, in quotes, went to the education of Terry Buford was Navy intelligence money. It was actually going to the Jim Jones operation. The San Francisco Examiner has an article, December the 19th, 1978, that the People's Temple masterminded and tape-recorded Mayor Moscone in San Francisco and Mr. Freitas. There's a little conflict of interest here because District Attorney Joseph Freitas had hired as his assistant Tim Stone of the People's Temple. And Freitas is supposed to prosecute any people involved either in the murder of Leo Ryan that took place from the San Francisco base of People's Temple or the murder of Mayor Moscone. Yet both of these people were tape recorded by Terry Buford. She was their chief strategist. And there's an article that came out this week saying that she meticulously put on plastic gloves and typed death threats to various former members of the temple, that she rifled through garbage cans and spied on members of the temple. She managed their $11 million funds. She was a mastermind behind Jones. And that she would tape record at night. She would call up the mayor and the district attorney in San Francisco and get them when they were sleepy and try to catch them saying something about socialists and trap them, and had tape-recorded conversations of these people that she had these conversations between Jim Jones and the late Mayor Moscone and the district attorney Joseph Freitas and other politicians that they could use for blackmail. And I'm sure those tapes are still available, and this would cause Freitas to do a very weak prosecution of Dan White, who's been charged with killing Moscone. You can see the conflict of interest, or maybe you can't, in San Francisco, but this is one can of worms that has to be broken down because Tim Stone, the assistant DA for Mr. Freitas in San Francisco, was an active member of the People's Temple and set up its legal framework and worked with Terry Buford and these various people, and they tape-recorded conversations of Mr. Freitas. Moscone is dead, but they could blackmail the family if the family wanted to go further into Dan White. Dan White was missing for 2 years, and as I say, it's important to find out where he was or if he was under the mind control program down in Jim Jones' compound and then sent back to San Francisco to kill future witnesses. It was Terry Buford who said that the killing team and the orders come out from a particular woman living in San Francisco. We have Dan White, who immediately after the Jonestown affair killed George Moscone, a man that had been working with the People's Temple, the mayor who was a recipient of the used money and so charged with that. And Dan White was missing for 2 years, so it's important to find out where Dan White was. Was he down in Guyana being trained as an assassin and then brought back to the San Francisco Police Department and Fire Department as a sleeper who could kill upon order if they needed him to wipe out their witness? A San Francisco Bay Guardian, December 21st, 1978 has an article that said Charles Gary was told by Mark Lane, while the two of them were in the jungle, that an attorney for the People's Temple by the name of Chaiken, C-H-A-I-K-E-N, Gene Chaiken, he had been an attorney for Jim Jones, had been drugged several months earlier after he objected to some of Jones' activities. And Gary said that he demanded to see Chaiken. He wanted to see him while he was in Jonestown because Charles Gary was an attorney for Jim Jones. And Gene Chaiken, another temple attorney, went down to Jonestown. Well, while they were down there, Charles Gary and Mark Lane didn't see Gene Chaiken, but later he was among those that was dead. He and his family were among over 900 people that were dead down in Jonestown. Now, it's interesting that Mark Lane knew that Chaiken had been drugged months earlier and that they could not see him. The days that they were down there, they couldn't see him. And if they could send an attorney down there that represented him by Gene Chaiken, and he was drugged, and if Mark Lane could be involved in memos to send Grace Stevens down there, where a primary witness in the Martin Luther King case could be have a mind job on her and her mind erased, then it's also possible, the possibility that Dan White, when he was missing, was down in Jonestown also. And this is a question that has to be gone into further. There is so much information here. I hope I'm not giving you an information overload on this material, and I hope you'll be able to type it up or make some notes and follow it. I think some of the key points, again, involve Mark Lane and the mind control program. What did he do with the information that he obtained through the ad paid by Larry Flynt on the Kennedy assassination? Where are the witnesses, or are they being rubbed out? Is G. Philip Blakey in Guyana, the man that escaped to Barbados, related to Robert Blakey, G. Robert Blakey, of the House Select Committee on Assassinations? Was Grace Walden sent down there, or is she alive at Mark Lane's place? And did that have anything to do with the conditions that Congressman Ryan could only go there if Lane preceded him by 2-hour talk with Jim Jones? And is Grace Walden alive? That's an important story. And of course, where are the tapes of the conversations that Jim Jones and Terry Buford made with former Mayor George Moscone and Freitas in San Francisco? Certainly, District Attorney Joseph Freitas should be removed from prosecuting both Dan White and the People's Temple investigation, because there's such an obvious conflict of interest with him and Tim Stone from Stanford, who set up the People's Temple in the first place. So again, we're running out of time. I have hundreds of hours of material to share with you, but we do the best we can. I'll be back with you next week, and take care, and Happy New Year.
And that was the late, great Mae Brussell. And for more information on Mae, you can go to worldwatchers.info or maybrussell.com. So from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact St. Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow St. Patrick on Twitter at MWN_St. Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and St. Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.